One-man masterminds the largest gold mining scam in history.
Surely one of the biggest frauds in the history of the world, probably the biggest mining fraud of all time.
He outwitted scientists, analysts, and the world's leading investors.
There was always some science backing up this fraud.
He turned a penny stock into $1 billion scam and made himself millions. Find out how, next on Masterminds. On December 13th, 1993, a lone prospector entered the darkest jungles of Borneo and discovered the biggest gold strike of the 20th century.
These series of jungle hills in Indonesia, which all had been formed by a volcano, were lying on top of a pool of gold.
The prospector staked a claim on behalf of a small mining company named Bre-X. He ordered rock samples drilled and sent for testing.
There was some interesting core results, and it seemed like this could be one of those junior plays that made people a lot of money.
Independent auditors assessed the size of the gold deposit as astronomical.
And they started to realize that they had what they thought was an elephant deposit, a great big puddle of gold.
Bre-X stock took off like a rocket. The prospector used the money to expand his operation. He cleared hundreds of acres of jungle and brought in sophisticated excavation machinery.
The analysts on Bay Street and Wall Street got caught up in the excitement.
And every time they published more details about this gold find in Indonesia, the market capitalization of the company, the size of the company, would jump.
This company went from $1 or $2 to $286.
This was the largest gold deposit in the world.
Back in Indonesia, the prospector kept uncovering more and more gold.
Gold was trading at $350 US an ounce. If you multiply it out, it's about $70 billion US.
Fueled by greed, everyone from boardroom executives to middle-class suburbanites wanted in on the action.
Everybody wanted to be the suitor to walk down the aisle with Bre-X.
Even the corrupt Indonesian government tried to muscle in. But what no one knew was, there was no gold, not 1 ounce. The lone prospector cashed in his company's stock options and made off with millions, leaving investors devastated.
People who have basically put a lot of their life savings into Bre-X lose everything. And I know of several individuals who committed suicide.
The prospector had engineered an unparalleled gold rush, outsmarting scientists, analysts, and investors. His name was Michael de Guzman. The question is, how did he do it? Michael de Guzman has convinced the world to invest in a gold mine that isn't there, turning a penny stock into $1 billion venture and lining his pockets with millions.
Michael de Guzman was a Filipino geologist who worked in Indonesia.
For years, de Guzman struggles for recognition in an industry dominated by large American mining companies.
Mike de Guzman knew he was smart, he had fabulous marks, he had an engineering degree, but he never got a great job. He never got a crack at a great job. It's very difficult for the Filipinos, even with extremely good engineering training, to get senior jobs with the big mining companies.
While exploring the jungles of Borneo, de Guzman devises a plan to make himself rich. Unable to get the support he needs to find a gold mine, he decides to invent one.
Michael de Guzman was going to get the wealth that he could never aspire to otherwise.
De Guzman reasons that the most convincing site for the world's largest gold mine is on the Indonesian island of Borneo.
In the area around Indonesia is an area which is quite unusually rich in gold. Gold mines are associated with volcanic activity quite a bit, so areas where you get volcanoes, people find gold mines.
De Guzman concocts a geological theory to capitalize on what the experts already believe.
And the theory essentially was, where there are extinct volcanoes, you're going to kind of have a plug of minerals, like gold, that are fairly close to the surface.
Now de Guzman must find someone with credibility to sell his idea to the world. He targets geologist John Felderhoff.
John Felderhoff is the very sort of person you would imagine that would be crazy enough to go through the jungles of Kalimantan or Borneo, wearing hip waders and looking for gold.
He had actually a well-established reputation of having discovered a gold mine in Indonesia.
De Guzman convinces Felderhoff to find a foreign investor who's willing to take risks and not ask questions. Felderhoff recommends a businessman from Western Canada.
David Walsh was this promoter. He'd been bankrupt. He'd been sort of living out of the trunk of his car. He was the kind of guy who was always talking up a story.
Walsh is flown to Indonesia, where he's wined and dined in the finest hotel in Jakarta.
Walsh was at a point where he was looking for some promising properties, and he spent basically his last few bucks to take a trip to Indonesia.
With nothing more than a few rocks, maps, and some questionable data, de Guzman sells Walsh on investing 80 grand on a property in Borneo that he's never even seen. It's called Busang.
The thing that made the Bre-X fraud credible in everybody's eyes was that one of the largest gold mines in the world is in the Indonesian islands, about 70 miles away from what became Busang.
In exchange for their work exploring Busang, de Guzman demands stock options for himself and Felderhoff. Now de Guzman sets out to turn this penny stock company into a corporation worth billions. He starts by hiring a young Filipino staff, over which he has total control.
Well, the person really in charge on site in Busang was Michael de Guzman.
De Guzman orders his team to drill core samples. Once extracted, the core sample is split in two. Typically, half is stored on site. The other half is then crushed and sent to a lab to be tested, determining how much gold is present. But because de Guzman knows the property has no gold, he employs an age-old mining trick called salting.
Salting refers to adding gold to the ore. Usually what would happen is you'd have a gold mine and you go there and you take gold nuggets, sprinkle it around the way you'd sprinkle salt around.
De Guzman orders the crushed rock moved to a locked shed, where he's sure to have absolute privacy. Inside, he devises an ingenious method of salting the samples, with gold filed from his wedding ring.
Adding it to the ground-up rock. As far as I know, that's not been done before. That was a novel twist.
The challenge to Michael is then taking 40 pounds of rock, figuring out exactly how many gold flakes should go in there. In other words, there's 3 ounces of gold per ton of rock. So he's got to do a fair amount of division, and he's got to carefully weigh out his gold.
If he'd grabbed a teaspoonful and chucked it in, the gold grade would have been phenomenal, and people would have gone, and it would have attracted attention.
De Guzman's calculations are perfect. The lab results suggest high levels of gold without raising suspicion. De Guzman has his frontman, John Felderhoff, call David Walsh at his home in Western Canada and tell him the good news. The lab results are the equivalent of a hot tip.
The market came to really look forward to these results. You know, there'd be a big excitement. Walsh would say, on Tuesday, we should have core results for you. Tuesday would come, sure enough, there'd be 10 or 12 new holes.
As each consecutive lab result is posted, it appears that more and more gold is being found in Busang. Investors rush to buy Bre-X shares listed on the Alberta Stock Exchange in Canada. There's so much drilling at Busang that de Guzman needs a larger supply of gold in order to keep salting the thousands of samples.
There's a lot of local Indonesian natives who make their living, or at least a part of their living, by panning for gold in the rivers. Michael befriended this fellow and started buying gold off him. So over a period of about 2 years, Michael bought about $61,000 worth of gold off this guy.
Meanwhile, Investors anxious to get in on the deal send over an independent auditor to review all de Guzman's records. The auditor demands to see de Guzman's core samples. But de Guzman hasn't saved half the samples.
They did split their core all right, but they only kept 10 centimeters out of every meter. That's very unusual.
To prevent the auditor from becoming suspicious, de Guzman is ready with an explanation. He cites a phenomenon called the nugget effect, in which the gold is distributed unevenly. De Guzman insists he must crush all of the sample in order to get an accurate reading.
The key was crushing up all the core. Nobody could check. By having crushed up all the core, basically they destroyed the evidence.
But when the auditor takes a closer look at the samples, he's suspicious about the river gold purchased by de Guzman.
The gold you get from panning in a river looks quite different from the gold that you find at the bottom of a gold mine. River gold gets rounded around the edges. The flakes of gold are shaped by the forces of the water and the weather.
De Guzman uses his theory of volcanic pools to explain why this kind of gold is precisely what you would expect at Busang. Within hours, the Bre-X website announces the successful audit and the stock rises dramatically.
You could watch this stock move. It would go from $20 to $30 in the space of 3 weeks.
Building on his success with the auditor, de Guzman now moves to drive the stock price even higher.
They looked at their maps and they said, okay, well, if there's gold here, maybe there'll be gold over here as well. And that's when they got into Busang 2.
De Guzman finds enough surface gold to convince David Walsh to finance drilling for what he claims is a second massive gold deposit. Once again, de Guzman has Felderhoff fire off a message to David Walsh. We've got a monster by the tail. Walsh pounces on it. He applies for Bre-X to be listed on the NASDAQ and the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Wall Street and investors elsewhere and analysts elsewhere were totally on side, were totally enthusiastic, were totally hypnotized by the rising stock price, by the rising claims of Bre-X.
Now de Guzman makes his boldest claim. Based on drilling results from Busang 2, he declares that Bre-X has the largest gold deposit in the world.
The investors just looked at the rising stock price and said, this must be real.
Having built Bre-X into a company worth $6 billion, and with its stock price at nearly $300 a share, it's time for de Guzman to start cashing in. He and his team sell enough shares to be rewarded with over $100 million.
When Felderhoff and when Walsh and when de Guzman started selling a part of their holdings, but not all of it, people just figured, well, that's just guys who've had a tough run all their lives, and they're just taking out some insurance.
De Guzman is now worth millions. But what he doesn't know is the Indonesian government is about to make a move that threatens to reveal his scam. Michael de Guzman has pulled off the biggest fraud in mining history. He's fooled the world's leading investors, turned a penny stock into a billion-dollar venture, and lined his pockets with millions. But he's now facing a real crisis.
The beginning of the end for Bre-X was a problem in Indonesia. The Indonesian government, which is hideously corrupt, decides to challenge Bre-X's claim to this fabulous deposit.
In August of 1996, the Indonesian government revokes Bre-X's exploration permit and opens the property to other mining companies.
The government itself was going to get very much involved in the ownership of the deposit, and they were going to invite who they wanted to see to develop the deposit.
So what you saw unfold in rather ugly fashion between the summer of 1996 and the spring of 1997 was this fight amongst major companies for a piece of the action.
Michael de Guzman knows his drilling records will soon come under scrutiny from the other mining companies, a move that's sure to reveal the Bre-X fraud. Desperate, he destroys all his records at Busang, claiming it was an accidental fire.
What went up in smoke that day would ultimately help cover the trail of the conspirators that did this fraud.
The Indonesian government forces Bre-X to accept a new mining partner, Freeport-McMoRan. From now on, Bre-X owns only 45% of Busang. When news gets out, Bre-X stock drops $1 billion. But de Guzman counters. He releases new drilling results that dramatically increase the estimated gold reserves underground.
They had previously said that they had 57 million reserves, and they increased that to slightly over 70 million reserves. Given that the ownership that they had in percentage went down, to make the value be the same, they had to increase the reserves.
Bre-X stock rises again. Shareholders are thrilled. In the spring of 1997, de Guzman and his team are invited to be guests of honor at Bre-X's annual shareholder meeting in Toronto, Canada.
Michael de Guzman made a presentation as part of the Bre-X annual meeting to talk about what he'd found and to talk about what the different drill results had proven that was underneath the ground. He was able to stand before shareholders with this fabulously expensive stock, a company that's worth $5 billion, and said, look, we did the best deal we could under the circumstances. We're all rich. Isn't this great?
He was widely applauded, considered a hero. His theories of mining, even though they were slightly unusual, seemed to be validated by the results.
But on the other side of the world, Bre-X's new partner is anxiously drilling for gold, only yards away from where de Guzman had drilled.
And their samples came up empty. They weren't finding the gold that Michael de Guzman had said was there.
De Guzman got the phone call, "We don't seem to find any of the gold you say is there. Get your story behind, back to Indonesia pronto, pal, and explain this to us."
After 3 years and billions of dollars, time is running out for the mastermind behind the world's largest fraud. When Bre-X's powerful new partner doesn't find gold at Busang, Michael de Guzman is forced back to Indonesia.
The next morning, he climbs into the back of a helicopter driven by a Indonesian Air Force officer, takes off over the jungle. He's about 400 or 500 feet in the air over some of the deepest rainforest in all of Indonesia. And the pilot looked into the back seat, and de Guzman was gone. De Guzman had jumped out of the helicopter, apparently.
3 days later, the Indonesian army claims to find de Guzman's body. It's badly decomposed and partially eaten by animals. It's so gruesome, the authorities won't let his family view the remains.
It was very difficult to believe that they took 2-3 days, I recall, to find the body, when in fact the pilot said he did set the GPS recorder, so they should have been able to find the spot.
Rumors swirl about de Guzman's death. Was it suicide, murder, or yet another perfectly planned deception?
If you wanted to disappear anywhere on this planet, Indonesia would be one of the easier places to do it. That you could, for a few $100s, purchase a recently deceased body.
Independent drilling takes place directly beside where de Guzman took thousands of samples, and not a single ounce of gold is found.
They go and they drill their own core samples, and the security they have around that is unmatched. They are drilling 2 or 3 feet away from where Bre-X says there's tons of gold. All they find is rock flake. There is no gold there.
It looked so good, it couldn't be real. I mean, it was too good to be real.
It's an unbelievable revelation. They just can't believe that this fabulous deposit, in fact, never existed.
Investors around the world suddenly realize they've been had.
Walsh is just flabbergasted. He cannot believe that this is happening. And it's that point that the Bre-X team in Toronto realizes that they've got nothing to go on, that their stock is going to zero because this was a massive fraud. Shares themselves are only useful as wallpaper.
David Walsh adamantly denies any knowledge of the fraud. He moves to the Bahamas with his wife. 2 years later, he dies of a massive heart attack.
John Felderhoff continues to live in a gorgeous home right next to the yacht club in the Cayman Islands, where there's no tax and there's also no extradition treaty with Canada for white-collar crimes.
Michael de Guzman, the mastermind behind the greatest mining scam of all time, is supposedly laid to rest.
I compare him to Rumpelstiltskin. He was able to turn a very small amount of gold into a huge amount. He spun a story into a huge amount of gold.
No criminal charges have arisen out of the Briac scandal. No one has ever spent a day in jail as a result of it.
The fraud itself has changed the way that Canadian regulators look at the mining industry.
It would be somewhat more difficult to pull off a similar type of scam, but it isn't impossible. It's probably still could be done again.
The adage, caveat emptor, is indeed true. Buyer beware.
In spite of class action lawsuits, not one investor has ever been compensated. A harsh reality for thousands of ordinary people who invested their life savings in Briacs and were left penniless.
I actually believe that Michael de Guzman is alive. I don't think that he did fall out of that helicopter. I believe that he faked his own death and that he's enjoying the money that he scammed at Briacs.
The press called him Indiana Jones, a daring tomb raider who looted ancient artifacts from Egypt.
He obviously recognized that there was a potential to make a huge income from smuggling these antiquities into the West and selling them.
His accomplices idolized him as a master of deception.
The idea behind the smuggling operation is a fantastic, very, very clever idea. It's brilliant.
He was a top player in a dangerous game.
I was immensely proud of what I was doing. It's a game which requires wit and skill and very good nerves.
For 10 years, he eluded authorities on 2 continents and made millions. Find out how he did it. Next on Masterminds. Beneath the sands of Egypt lie the remains of 5,000 years of human history. In the early 90s, there was an upsurge in the smuggling of these ancient artifacts.
Property was being excavated from the ground and then suddenly turning up in the West and being sold for huge profits.
In an effort to protect their priceless cultural heritage, Egyptian authorities cracked down. Security was dramatically increased.
The risks are considerable. Egyptian prisons are not a place that you want to spend a great deal of time in.
But in London, the center of the illegal antiquities trade, British authorities noticed a flood of illicit goods still coming onto the market.
Various people across the Western world were prepared to pay bigger and bigger money. Presuming that you have the expertise, you can make millions of pounds per year.
Police feared someone had found a way to beat the system.
He was manipulating the whole system for financial gain. He exploits the antiquity market, but he exploits it brilliantly.
Then in 1993, a 3,000-year-old sculpture of an ancient pharaoh, Amenhotep III, came onto the London market.
It was an extremely significant piece. It was a very rare piece.
At the height of the Gulf War, with security at an all-time high, a master smuggler had found a way to do the impossible.
If I had been caught at that time, they'd have killed me.
His most brilliant move was being able to transport it out of Egypt without raising any questions
To get the piece out of the country, he took the shadowy art of smuggling to a level law enforcement had never seen before. Back in England, the statue was transformed from contraband into a legitimate collector's piece and sold for over $1 million.
He was a mastermind of smuggling antiquities from Egypt.
A lot of the newspapers over here saw me as a sort of Indiana Jones. I saw myself as something very old-fashioned and very traditional, doing something that the English do well, smuggling, with calm nerves and moral courage, and a sense of fun, sense of humour.
Jonathan Tokely Perry was a dashing romantic figure and one of the most ingenious smugglers of the 20th century. The question is, how did he do it? Jonathan Tokely Perry is one of the 20th century's greatest antiquities smugglers, eluding massive security to escape from Egypt with $1 million sculpture. But this mastermind with nerves of steel didn't start out like Indiana Jones. Born into a middle-class family, Tokely Perry is accepted into prestigious Cambridge University. He develops an interest in art and antiquities and reinvents himself as an upper-class gentleman.
My family wanted me to get on a train and go into the city and make a lot of money and have a heart attack when I was 50. And I point-blank refused.
He's a complex character. He has almost a heightened sense of honour. He wanted to go into the army, but was turned down. He then joined the territorial army, sort of weekend soldiers, part-timers.
Denied the opportunity to pursue a full-time military career, Tokely Perry returns to his first love, the past.
Just touching something ancient was a wonderful feeling. You catch a vibration, and I knew that that was what I wanted to do.
After training as an antiquities restorer, he quickly gains an international reputation.
I was the highest paid restorer in England, probably Europe. But I still could not afford to buy any of these wonderful objects. I would have the most stunning things on my table that I restored and brought back to life, and then I'd have to give them back. And I realized that a restorer is just a servant.
What Tokely Perry wants is to be his own master.
He was restoring objects for dealers who were selling them for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds. And I think his head was turned.
He obviously recognised that there was a potential to make a huge income from smuggling these antiquities into the West and selling them.
Egypt is the place if you have a passion for antiquities. 3,000 years of continuous civilization, an enormous number of objects and buildings, and the feeling that at any time something wonderful is going to turn up.
Tokely Perry travels to Cairo under the guise of a researcher. There he makes contact with a local smuggler.
He befriended a chap called Ali Farag, who was the youngest of a large family, all of whom were engaged in smuggling antiquities out of Egypt.
Ali Farag tells Tokely Perry about an artifact that has been found at a construction site. But the Gulf War is raging, and Tokely Perry must proceed with extreme caution.
The country was under full military alert. Foreigners were being arrested if they were seen with Egyptians. I was actually hiding in the boot of the car because there were roadblocks everywhere. Went out to the southern suburbs of Cairo.
A building contractor with connections to the smuggling underworld has unearthed an ancient artifact. Tokely Perry realizes he's looking at a 3,000-year-old sculpture that will make him a very rich man, if he can keep his cool.
The Egyptians are the best salesmen in the world. They are psychologically so brilliant.
The high-stakes game begins.
He was looking at me, and I met his eyes and looked away. The last thing I'm going to do is let this one go, because I've been waiting for 5 years for this.
Tokely Perry is desperate, but so is the contractor. Jonathan calls his bluff.
The Egyptians were panicking. They were desperate for currency.
Now the master dealmaker drives a very hard bargain. $6,000 cash for a $1 million piece of history.
I had my first world-class piece. There wasn't any period of feeling, oh, the world is wonderful, God's on my side. All I realized was, oh, Christ, how am I going to get this out?
Because being caught with the piece could be fatal, he must think fast.
His most brilliant move, and the move that no one else had identified, was the actual disguising of the piece.
And that meant preparing it, which was to make the object look as much as possible like a kitsch, bizarre thing, the sort that idiots buy in the hotel shops all the time. To do this, I had to take a battered antiquity and make it look like a modern, complete object. So I had to build up, make up the things which were missing.
He coats the statue with a gum and applies gold leaf. He polishes the leaf, then paints the sculpture so it looks like a cheap souvenir. He then buys a real souvenir, keeps the receipt, removes the base, and places the sculpture on it.
Having done that, the object looked absolutely ghastly, but it gave us a good chance of getting through. Security was doubled. There were armed soldiers everywhere. In fact, it was just complete bloody madness for me to do it. And the consequences of getting it wrong would be really, really nasty. I would have been taken to the desert and not come back.
At the airport, security is everywhere. Tokely Perry is stopped by the antiquities police.
Made me open the suitcase, and he said, "What is this?" I said, "Oh, it's a present. Here's the receipt." And I tried to distract him by holding the receipt. And then, the bit I dreaded, he reached into his pocket and he brought out his bloody keys. Now, Egyptians are very good with keys. They get a key and they scratch the surface. And I knew that if he scratched on the face, he would go straight through to the stone and I'd be buggered. And as he went to scratch, I said, "No, no, not there, underneath, much better." I had to get him down to the base where I'd prepared an extra inch of plaster just for him to scratch. And he saw the plaster, looked at it, and waved his hand and wandered off. And thank God I got it right.
Back in England, he sails through customs. But his work is far from complete. First, he must remove the elaborate disguise without damaging the sculpture. Breaking the gilding in plaster is far too risky, but his expert knowledge of chemistry pays off. Before he covered the statue in plaster, he coated it with a protective layer of plastic.
I put it into a bath of acetone, and gradually, gently, everything will float off, leaving the antiquity exactly as I received it in Egypt.
He then took it to the next stage, where he actually changed the eye line, he added part of the beard to it. In his own words, give it a better line so that the collectors would pay more money for it.
But if buyers suspect the piece is stolen, they'll alert police. So he now forges documents to give the statue a convincing history.
To make the labels, I took some Victorian pharmacy labels, cut out the letters, rearranged them, had them printed on a very old stock of paper, and then practiced my copperplate 20s handwriting with ink which I'd chemically faded. And then, having cut out the label, I aged it, I soaked it in tea, I dried it, I wet it, I dried it again. So I had a label that looked thoroughly scratched and ancient.
He glues the label to the back of the sculpture.
It would appear that the object hadn't come from Egypt at all, had come from an old country collection in England.
Tokely Perry is now ready to strike. Through his network of international antiquities dealers, he sells the sculpture for $1 million.
I couldn't believe it. It seemed that I'd actually achieved what I wanted in one hit.
But this success is just the beginning. And Tokely Perry's ambition to be the world's greatest antiquities smuggler will soon threaten to bring him down. Jonathan Tokely Perry has made $1 million smuggling the sculpture of Amenhotep III. Over the next 4 years, he continues to secretly export Egyptian antiquities and reaps a fortune.
Jonathan indulged himself with his lifestyle. He had several suits made by his Devon tailor. He bought an extremely expensive sports car.
I made millions of pounds, which was nice. It's nice to be paid for what you love doing.
As soon as the money got bigger, the objects got bigger, and the whole game became more dangerous and more sophisticated, he realised that he needed a mule to carry these pieces out.
Jonathan targets Mark Perry, a local handyman.
Jonathan Perry walked in and I was sort of awestruck by him. I think he saw I was gullible in the first place. He knew that, you know, here's a lad, young family, very short of money.
Tokely Perry offers Mark £500 a week, plus all the adventure he can handle.
Somebody comes along to me and says, you're going over to Egypt, you're going to stay in a hotel, all expenses paid, and I'm going to pay you for it. But I had the chance of adventure, I had the chance of money, and getting away from the day-to-day realities of life. I could actually do something.
Tokely Perry soon introduces his protege to Egypt's smuggling underworld.
We arrived in Cairo, and nothing prepared me for what I was about to feel that day. Just amazing to see. And of course, again, I was awestruck by it all.
I showed Mark what I was doing.
He even trained him in how to camouflage the objects. And then Mark would bring them back to this country.
And I took him through customs once to show him the techniques. And I instructed him very, very carefully what to do if there was any problem.
I did all the dirty donkey work. It was my life on the line. I've carried £500,000 worth of antiquity in a bag through the centre of Cairo and not even thought anything of it. Didn't even realise what I had. All I was wanting to do was get back for a beer in the bar.
With his mule in place, Tokely Perry now hires a more sophisticated partner to help negotiate with the Egyptians. He makes a deal with Andrew May, an aristocrat fallen on hard times.
We had a gentleman's understanding that he would only take the smaller pieces that were no longer of any concern to me, and that he would train himself in the market. And eventually, maybe in a decade's time, he would take over from me.
But Andrew May soon turns out to be a problem.
The mistake he made with Andrew May was that, having gone to Egypt and seen the huge amounts of money that could be made, and Andrew May began buying pieces and bringing them out, as well as bringing out Jonathan's pieces.
He was too greedy and too hungry and too frightened, and he tried, putting it very simply, to rip me off.
The big difference between Jonathan and Andrew was that Jonathan had worked with antiquities for many, many years as a restorer. Jonathan had done his homework. Andrew, in the space of months, tried to pull off the same act and lacked the knowledge.
In Cairo, May buys a collection of rare ancient Egyptian documents known as papyrus. But fearing the artifacts are fake, he takes them to the British Museum to be authenticated.
It was one of the most stupid things that you could possibly have done.
Museum archaeologists quickly realize these are artifacts that they had originally discovered and that had been stolen in Egypt. They contact police.
When we were contacted by the British Museum, formed an opinion immediately that it was such a dumb thing to have done that this person couldn't possibly be responsible for the theft and the looting of this material. When we started to research Andrew May, we found that he was the owner of a manor house in Devon. One of his tenants was Jonathan Tokely Perry, somebody who had a large collection of Egyptian material and was working as a restorer.
The police are ready to move against Tokely Perry. But when they arrive at his home, he isn't there. They have to break in.
We found Jonathan Tokely Perry's workshop. And it was in the workshop that we found a vast amount of antiquities.
So it was fortuitous, or perhaps unfortuitous for Jonathan, that he turned up while we were in his house.
When I got to my front door, I could see that my kitchen window had been smashed. And there was a grey, stout man there. And I said to him, "Have I been burgled? What's happening?" And he said, "We're the police." And I said, "Oh, thank God you're here." And he said, "Well, actually, we did that, and we're here to arrest you." And I said, "Well, why couldn't you bloody knock like anybody else?"
Jonathan reacted in a typical Jonathan way. He put on his superior air, that he was better than anyone else who might be there. He huffed and puffed. He had a rational explanation for everything that he was doing.
Jonathan Tokley Perry is arrested on the charge of handling stolen property. His 10-year, multi-million-dollar smuggling operation has finally caught up with him. But putting him in prison will prove extremely difficult. Jonathan Tokley Perry is arrested, but cannot be charged with smuggling because his crimes were committed in Egypt.
And to actually prosecute Jonathan in this country was not easy.
The police are forced to charge him with the lesser crime of handling stolen property. Although he is eventually found guilty, authorities are troubled by the difficulty of bringing him to justice. As a result, new laws are enacted, giving police the power to charge smugglers in their country of residence.
The case itself has redrawn the legal lines for the antiquities market, the antiquities trade in not just this country, not just in the USA, but for the world.
But to this day, Tokley Perry believes he did nothing wrong.
I was immensely proud of what I was doing because, having seen what was going on in Egypt, I was aware that if it weren't for people like me, a lot of those objects would be destroyed.
I've no doubt that he justified his actions to himself through being the modern-day Robin Hood, saving antiquities for the world. Despite what Jonathan would like to think of himself, he is and was a criminal.
After serving 3 years of a 6-year sentence, Jonathan Tokley Perry is released. He is currently working again as a restorer and is often consulted by police investigating the illegal antiquities trade. A lone woman pulls off the biggest home burglary spree in American history.
She's this criminal mastermind that became this sort of folk hero in South Florida.
Stealing over $6 million in jewelry, furs, and artwork.
She's basically shopping through these people's houses.
She changed her appearance like a chameleon.
And left the police helpless to stop her.
And I said to myself, my God, where is she not hitting? How about the Bahamas? Are they safe? How is this woman not getting caught?
Find out how she did it. Next on Masterminds. During the early 1980s, cocaine wars caused an unprecedented urban crime wave in Miami. To escape, the affluent moved further north, to gated and patrolled communities like Boca del Mar. and Boca Raton.
It was people getting out of Miami. They were people with money. There was a lot of wealth, fabulous wealth along the intercoastal.
But in 1984, these well-protected communities were hit by a spree of over 500 home burglaries.
It was not uncommon for us in a 5-day period to investigate anywhere from 10 to 12 burglaries in Boca del Mar or in the Boca Raton area. The frequency and the dollar loss started to mount real quick.
The people of Boca del Mar could not go to work and do their shopping without having to worry that their homes were being burglarized.
The loss was not only staggering in dollar amount, but it was alarming in that it wasn't just the typical jewelry and or, say, expensive electronic equipment. It was just about anything of value.
All of South Florida was being racked by this one burglar. It wasn't your typical run-of-the-mill crook that we were dealing with. I mean, burglaries went unsolved.
Police discover similar MOs in all the crimes.
The burglaries always occurred during Monday through Friday. The point of entry was always through the front door. And that pillowcases were missing from the master bedroom. There was no witnesses, there was no latent prints. The perpetrator was obviously the same person.
The police were unable to identify the perpetrator because they assumed the crimes could only have been committed by a man.
This completely blew me off my feet. Here I'm dealing with a prolific burglar who's a woman and very good at what she does.
That was what was so cool about it. You know, she wasn't the person that I imagined stealing my VCR.
Judy Amar was the mastermind behind America's largest home burglary spree, stealing over $6 million in furs, jewelry, and artwork.
It was just an exciting feeling. I just thought, wow, this is marvelous. Catch me if you can.
The question is, how did she do it? Judy Amar is the mastermind behind the greatest home burglary spree in U.S. history, leaving the police helpless to stop her. Amar grew up poor on an Arkansas farm.
Very boring, not adventuresome. It was a farming community, and I really didn't like what I was doing.
After an unwanted teenage pregnancy, she leaves her child to be raised by her parents and moves to Miami.
I was told that, nobody wanted me, I wasn't good looking. The same thing that most girls get in trouble for.
In Miami, desperate to support herself, she accepts an offer from a boyfriend to help him rob homes.
So I needed money. He asked me to drive him somewhere because no one would be suspicious of a woman. You go in the house, you look for the jewelry. That's it, you come back to the car. He wasn't really that good at it. He always seemed to mess up everything.
During a burglary, Judy and her accomplice are arrested by the police. However, due to insufficient evidence, all charges are dropped.
From now on, if I'm taking a chance of getting arrested, and I'm going alone. It was better because I didn't have to worry about him messing up something or getting in my way. So that's when I started.
She had a lot of different abilities that made it a natural choice, so to speak, for her. She had a plan and a scheme, and that's what made her different than your average burglar.
Amar now sets out to revolutionize home burglary, starting with how she finds her targets.
The Sunday real estate section was Judy's Guide to Burglary. It's where developers of housing projects try to tout the amenities they're offering in their homes. Basically, they lay out all these floor plans, which for a burglar, in hindsight, it's incredible information. She used that to her advantage. She could see whether these homes were being sold, for instance, with security systems installed. She could see if the doors were recessed, just from looking at the house diagrams. She could plan 30 burglaries in 30 different brand new neighborhoods sitting there with the Palm Beach Post.
Having determined her target, Amar now creates the perfect persona for herself.
The wigs were, by far and away, the greatest asset she had in trying to disguise herself.
I had several different ones. I had a long, straight with bangs, one that was done with curls that was frosted. I had an afro. I had a short one, but I would just change.
Judy knew how to dress when she went out. High heels. She always wore high heels, slacks, because she did know that she might have to make some sort of getaway. She just looked good, you know, she looked like she belonged.
No one would give her a second thought because professional businesswomen is a very common occurrence here in Boca del Mar and in Boca Raton. Very common to see a woman executive or a woman real estate agent dressed this way.
She could go into gated communities and just, you know, wave at the guard. Hi, how you doing? And she'd look like she belonged there, which is something that her compatriots couldn't pull off.
The next step in Amar's plan is to obtain untraceable transportation.
The idea is to change the automobiles as often as possible. If the police are looking for a red Plymouth, you come back in a blue Chevrolet, you completely befuddled everyone. They're not looking for that car.
At least once a week, she rents a different car and always pays in cash.
So you give them $300, $500, and you take the car. As long as you keep the payments up, you don't have a problem.
To further ensure her vehicle is untraceable, Amar changes the license number to prevent witnesses from correctly identifying her car. Having found her target and secured transportation, Amar now determines the perfect time to strike.
She would look for our deputies, and she'd stay back several car lengths and just watch them and follow them. And if he went into a particular restaurant, she knew that darn well that the deputy was now going to eat. That's a good 30 minutes.
For Amar, this is the window of opportunity. She heads immediately to her target. She has chosen this house because its recessed front door helps conceal her activities.
Because I would have covering, and the people next door really couldn't see anyone standing there.
She would put that Gucci bag on her arm and strides right up to the door like she belonged there. She knew where she was going. She'd knock on the door. She could think on her feet. Someone caught her in the act of something, she would say, "Oh, I've got the wrong house. I'm so sorry to bother you." She leaves. But if there's no one there, no one answers the knock, no dogs are barking, she goes to work.
And inside of her purse was her 12-inch long screwdriver.
She knew exactly where to place the screwdriver to get this door open.
She would insert the blade of the screwdriver between the frame of the door and the locking mechanism and jam it as far as she could possibly get it and begin to bend it. And eventually the lock is wide open and she uses the screwdriver to push the lock back. Now she's got an entry into the house.
The only problem is, she's triggered the alarm system.
Judy was not afraid of alarms.
The vast majority of alarm calls are false alarms, and the police know that, and Judy knew that.
The master bedroom was first. At that point, she knew she had about 60 seconds before the alarm system would go off. She'd go to the closet, get the designer clothes, grab a pillowcase off the bed.
She knew what she was looking for. Things that would sell well.
It was a strand of pearls with a piece of jade in the middle, and it had sapphires and diamonds around it.
She's basically shopping through these people's houses.
There was 2 Piaget watches, beautiful antique pieces.
Things that she would like and might keep for herself.
Amar is in and out in 90 seconds. But she's so bold, she goes back for more.
After I got that in the car, I had seen the Remington statue on the way out, and I went back in and took it.
Judy Amar is at the height of her powers, stealing $250,000 worth of goods in a single burglary. The only problem is her past is about to catch up with her. America's most prolific home burglar, Judy Amar, has broken into hundreds of houses and scored over $6 million in jewelry, furs, and art.
Now they've increased from 1 reported on Tuesday and 1 on Wednesday to 2 or 3 on Monday, 4 on Tuesday, 2 on Wednesday. I mean, she was just having a field day. She was going wild.
Then in 1985, the police finally get a lucky break.
And a man came home from work and actually found Judy in his house. And she literally ran right past him, got in the car and drove away.
For the first time, the police realize the criminal they're searching for is a woman.
One of the other detectives had remembered a woman who years before had been arrested for the same thing in the same area.
When the police search their database for that period, it reveals Judy's name.
I mean, it lit up just like if you hit 777 on a slot machine in Vegas. We got Judy's picture, put it in a lineup, brought it to him, and instantly he picked her out, said that was the woman.
The police also established the make and model of Judy's car. They issue a statewide bulletin. Despite her close call, Judy brazenly targets a second home that day.
One of our deputies had been alerted we were looking for a particular car that Judy was using. It was a blue Chevrolet. He's yelling into the radio that he had found the car and it was unoccupied. So he took up a position and waited for the troops to get there.
And there was a police dragnet forming, and she knew that she was about to get cornered.
Amar escapes out the back, then breaks into the house next door, where she finds a set of car keys.
And I pulled the wig off and go, because if someone had seen me and gave a description, they're giving the wrong one. I look nothing like it.
There's a Mercedes sedan parked in the garage. And she's so brazen, she waved to an officer, the officer waves back, and she got away. She just drives right through the police dragnet.
One of the detectives who she drove by, he had no real clue what she looked like that day because she changed her appearance like a chameleon. Today she could be a redhead, tomorrow she's a blonde, and on Friday she would be a brunette. This woman was good. When we realized that she had given us the slip, and I remember the temper tantrum that I had, which wasn't pretty, I was livid. I was angry at no one but Judy, and pretty much said to myself, okay, you just made this personal now. This case then came home with me. I had a closet in my house, and I used it as a little mini office. And I would work on this thing at night on my own time. And this became an obsession with me.
Scanning burglary reports from across the state, Tomasi recognizes Judy's MO and realizes she's hitting a much larger territory than he suspected.
She likes to travel. The city of Delray Beach is notifying us that they're having burglaries that match Judy's MO to the T. The city of Boca Raton is, the city of Plantation is, the city of Sunrise is, and then the city of Naples, which is on the other side of Florida, is telling us that they have cases that match. And I said to myself, my God, where is she not hitting? How about the Bahamas? Are they safe? I mean, you know, just how is this woman not getting caught?
It was a lot of work. You had to get up in the mornings just like you were going to a job. You had to find an area to burglarize. Sometimes it was from 8 till 6 or 7 at night.
As Judy's spree continues, police trace her abandoned blue Chevrolet back to a car rental agency near the airport.
They identified her and said, yeah, she comes in here on a regular basis. So now they knew she was wanted. They no longer wanted to do business with her, and they said, if she comes, we're going to call the police.
Tomasi now ups the ante.
We found out about her family in Arkansas and did a background on her son.
At his request, the FBI detains Judy's son.
We kind of figured if we put pressure on her family, that's going to be her Achilles heel. So we started talking to her son. Do you really want to have your mom resisting us and getting herself killed? We don't want your mom getting hurt. She's the one who's upping the ante on this every week.
The son refuses to give his mother up. When Judy learns the FBI is leaning on her family, she's outraged.
That hit a sore spot with Judy. That was her Achilles heel, was her son, because she became livid with me, and she called me from somewhere in Miami.
And told him to leave my family alone, that my family had nothing to do with this, and I was not in Arkansas.
She was furious at me for reaching out for her family. But if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes.
He said, you need to turn yourself in. I said, I can't do that.
Judy Amar's refusal to surrender, however, is about to threaten both her life and Ron Tomasi's. "16 months pass in the Amar burglary investigation without the police getting any closer to catching her.
They didn't know where to find her. They were being driven crazy. Poor Ron Tomasi, he became obsessed with finding Judy to the point where the little things that she would do would irritate him to no end. And he'd just get more and more stressed.
I said, I'm living this case. I'm eating this case. I'm breathing this case. I can't sleep at night because of this case.
And I love police detectives, but they're the most macho, guys in the world. They don't want anyone to get away with anything. But here's somebody who's clever and smarter and a woman, and they can't catch a girl. There was just something that was galling about that.
Pushed to the point of exhaustion, Tomasi suffers a heart attack and is forced off duty for weeks.
He was so obsessed with it. I think that was his problem. He had his hands full. His children even knew my name.
The very day that I went back to work, I was notified that Judy Amar had been identified as hiding in a motel in Surfside from an informant in Miami.
I think if it had not been for this guy and a drug charge, trying to get a lenient sentence, well, he told on him. He told her where she was.
With an army of undercover agents, Tomasi stakes out the motel.
So we had snipers and everybody in place. We didn't know what we were going to deal with, whether she was going to quietly submit to us or we would have to shoot it out. She came home at about 8:20, 8:30 in the morning. She comes to her door. And the moment she put the key into the motel door to open it, everybody came out.
I remember turning around, and the black guy, I think, had the chain with his badge around it. He's in a squat position with a gun like this.
She was so completely stunned, she said that she looked around, there were guns everywhere. She just, thank God, she just surrendered and it was over. The room was filled from top to bottom, from wall to wall, with statues, clothing, shoes, apparel, jewelry. You just couldn't imagine. It looked like a little warehouse or a little store. I remember when we sat as close as we are now, and I looked into her eyes, and she was crying. And then she said to me she was glad it was over. She actually told me, I'm glad it's over now. And I told her, same thing, I'm glad it's over.
Judy Amar pleads guilty to multiple charges of burglary and is sentenced to 10 years. In 1990, she is released from prison.
It was an obsession. I would go by a house, and it was just this haunting feeling. And then I decided that I was going to do things right no matter what. And I was determined not to burglarize anybody anymore.
Since her release, the Bandit Queen has used her unique skills to teach Americans how to make their homes more secure.
was one of the biggest crimes that committed in the century.
A crooked cop pulls off a bank job worth over $10 million.
He was talented, well organized, and incredibly intelligent.
He committed the perfect crime, then mocked authorities.
It's hard to describe the arrogance. He just figured he was untouchable.
Find out how he did it. Next, on Masterminds. Medford, Massachusetts. In the early 80s, this quiet suburb of Boston was booming.
People had jobs, people had money, people were spending money, people were making money.
There was a lot of money around, and there was a lot of money in the bank.
And the richest bank in Medford was Depositors Trust. Its security system was state-of-the-art.
The alarm is wired into both the alarm company and the police station. The vault has 18 inches of reinforced concrete.
There were massive time-lock steel doors. Inside was a safe and 1,000 double-key deposit boxes. The vault seemed impregnable. But on Memorial Day weekend, 1980, the unthinkable happened. Depositors Trust became the scene of the largest bank burglary in New England's history.
Come that Tuesday morning, the bank opened, and they opened up and said, "Oh my God, what happened here?"
$10 million in cash and jewels was gone. 1,000 armor-plated deposit boxes had been smashed open. The highly sophisticated silent alarm hadn't gone off, and the reinforced concrete ceiling had a hole blown through it.
It was incredibly bizarre. This is the type of a job you see in Hollywood. That's the type of crime this was.
The FBI was immediately notified and had jurisdiction over the crime scene. They did an extensive investigation.
There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, and no burglary tools.
Well, there was no evidence because they had been so careful about covering their tracks. They had made sure that anything that went into the bank came out with them. In that sense, it was the perfect crime. It's an immediate big story. And it's not just a big story at the Medford level. It's a big story at the state level and at the federal level.
The question then arose as to who were the suspects and who could have possibly perpetrated a job of this magnitude. But there was really no prime suspects at that point, other than the fact that it had to be a bunch of professionals.
The gang was led by a professional police officer, Captain Jerry Clemente. A career cop obsessed with money and power had pulled off a multi-million-dollar heist. The question is, how did he do it? Police Captain Jerry Clemente is the mastermind behind a $10 million heist at the Medford, Massachusetts Depositors Trust. The burglary is the climax of years of corruption that started with his first night on the force, when he was partnered with a veteran cop named Crusher.
They were going through Medford and they saw this guy running down the street holding a stolen lawn chair.
To Jerry's surprise, Crusher knows the thief.
He turned out to be another cop. The guy picks up the lawn chair, goes away. Crusher says to Jerry, two things, Jerry. Number one, if you see a cop with a television, a piece of furniture, anything at all, mind your own business. Whatever he's doing is his business. Number two, don't play high and mighty. The lesson he learned was corruption was accepted. It was easy to move beyond that, almost imperceptibly, to a point where you were doing wholesale corrupt activities.
Jerry quickly discovers he has a talent for planning and executing burglaries. He furnishes his entire house with stolen goods. But he's also a brave cop. Early in his career, Clemente is awarded a Medal of Valor for his role in the takedown of an armed gangster.
He had a good reputation in law enforcement circles. You know, he was a good guy, solid guy, you know, a go-to guy.
But his double life as criminal and crime fighter soon spills over into his personal affairs.
Here's a married man with a family, living, you know, a happily married life in a community on the surface,
who at the same time is having a clandestine sexual affair. So it certainly must have been part of Jerry's makeup to want to lead a double life.
As Clemente moves up through the ranks of law enforcement, he's drawn to more ambitious crimes. He partners with Sergeant Tom Doherty.
Tom Doherty was always a rogue. He was arrogant, out of control, and basically abused his badge from probably the first day he wore it.
In 1978, Clemente and Doherty pull their first big job. The target? The police department.
They would steal the police promotional exam before it was given, make copies of it, sell it for $5,000 to somebody who wanted to be a police chief someplace. They manipulated and controlled who they wanted in command positions in the city and town police departments. They were very powerful back at that time, very powerful. And Jerry Clemente was at the top of it.
Then in 1980, Clemente and Doherty see an opportunity to become multi-millionaires. They decide to hit depositors' trust.
They both knew in the back of their minds that this was the big score. This was, of all the planned criminal activities that they were involved in, this was the one that was going to set them up for life. Because Tommy had his own safety deposit box in the bank, he was able to go in and case the place. While he was in there, he mentally paced off the dimensions of the vault, noted, where the safes were, where the deposit boxes were.
Based on this information, Clemente knows he needs a specialized team to pull off the job. He recruits fellow crooked cop Joe Bangs and a gangster known as Brother O'Leary.
They were going to have to bypass the alarm, so they needed an alarm guy, and that was Bucky Barrett.
Bucky Barrett was, by all accounts, an expert at alarms and was, by all accounts, a professional burglar.
The alarm was a major obstacle that the gang had to get over because it was wired into both the Medford police station and to the alarm company. And it was a silent alarm. So if you triggered it at the bank, you wouldn't know that it had gone off.
Bucky realizes he'll have to bypass the alarm using sophisticated electronics. He assembles a device to block the outgoing signal. For 2 months, Clemente and Bucky Barrett return to the bank each night to test every wire.
He had to test each wire individually to figure out which was the alarm wire so he could set up the bypass box and disable the alarm.
Jerry also makes reconnaissance patrols.
They made dry runs, staked out the bank, much the way police officers would stake out an alleged scene of a crime. I mean, they staked out their scene of the crime.
Confident it's a go, Clemente now sets a date for the heist, the Memorial Day weekend.
During Memorial Day weekend in 1980, there were a number of public events going on, including a carnival, a lot of noise, a lot of commotion into the late night hours. That really worked very well for the conspirators.
The team now makes final preparations.
They had acetylene torches, they had dynamite, they had special magnesium burning rods, carbide core bits for the drills. Everything that they needed for any eventuality, they had prepared carefully ahead of time.
The night of the burglary, the gang moves into position. Clemente is confident he won't be discovered because his lookout man is the senior cop on duty for the entire city of Medford, Tommy Doherty.
If anybody did come along, he'd be able to make sure they moved on, or if they came too close, he could tell them to go away because he was, after all, a police officer.
With everything in place, Clemente sets his plan in motion.
The steps of the burglary began with them bypassing the alarm system at the rear of the building. After that was accomplished, Jerry Clemente picked the lock to the shop next door, which gave them access to the upper loft area.
Inside the shop's attic, they break through the wall leading to the bank.
That wall was made of cinder blocks. So in a matter of minutes, they had smashed through there. They were able to crawl into the crawl space above the vault.
So they then could start the tunnels through the actual ceiling of the vault.
Using power from a nearby fuse box, they start to drill through the vault ceiling.
And they knew exactly where to drill in order to create the hole, from Tommy having mentally cased the place.
You know, the old story, plan your work, work your plan. Everything was done exact to a T. They knew what they had to do. They were all disciplined guys.
At each step of the way, they would pause and wait, report back to Tommy. Tommy would make sure that nobody had heard anything, that nothing was being reported. He'd have a good look around. Then he'd give them the okay to go on to the next stage of the operation.
But an hour into the job, there's a big problem. Doherty radios Clemente to shut everything down and keep quiet. The owners of Brigham's restaurant next to the bank have come to take inventory. Clemente has Doherty spring into action.
Tommy went in, told these people, I'm sorry, we've had some, criminal activity around here lately. We really can't have you doing inventory in the middle of the night, and got them to leave and go home.
And they were quite impressed that, geez, great police response here.
Doherty gives Clemente the all clear. Above the vault, the men resume working on the 18 inches of steel-reinforced concrete. Clemente has brought dynamite, but he knows he's taking a risk.
The risk obviously being they're in the middle of a downtown area in Medford, that would be heard by the neighbors and that they would be discovered.
They pile sandbags on the dynamite to direct the blast downward and muffle the sound.
As it happens, nobody reported any sound. It's possible that people heard a loud bang, but maybe they thought it was revelry from the carnival.
The explosives were able to dislodge the concrete, but it still left the wire mesh that had to be cut with an acetylene torch.
It's hot, time-consuming work, but by 3 a.m. they break through the vault ceiling.
So when they dropped down into the vault, they had all of this debris all over the place and all of this dust floating in the air.
Their main target is the safe.
At the rear of the vault was a larger safe which the bank used for their cash for their customers.
Bucky sets to work with an acetylene torch. O'Leary and Bangs start prying open the safety deposit boxes. It takes an hour to cut through the safe's hinges.
Bucky opens the safe. There's only 60 grand. They're all incredibly disappointed. Months of preparation, careful planning, high risk, incredible expectations, and they're sitting there with $60,000.
Unfortunately, they found a very small amount of cash, principally because it was Memorial Day weekend and most of the cash had already been removed by the bank employees and sent to the Federal Reserve for the weekend.
There's nothing more Jerry can do. They've run out of time.
It's in May, so there's an early dawn, and they got to be out of there before it gets light. It's not turning out exactly the way that they thought it would, so they'll go back to Joe's house. So Jerry says, well, we've got 2 more nights to come back in and to go through and break open as many of these safety deposit boxes as we can.
Had this been your typical burglars, they would never have risked going back the second and third night. But Jerry Clemente knew that with 3 active police officers involved in this conspiracy, they had an absolute control over preventing anyone from law enforcement ever detecting that they were inside that vault.
Back in the vault, they set to work on the safety deposit boxes. But the problem is, it's taking 15 minutes to open each one.
Initially, they were breaking through these cylinder locks by manually using a screwdriver and breaking out these cylinder locks. They found that took an inordinate amount of time.
So then he discovered this new method, which was basically to use the chisel and hammer to break off the hinges.
It was much faster. It enabled them to open more doors in a quicker way.
Over the next 2 nights, the gang uses this new method to break into 1,000 deposit boxes and empty the vault.
So there was close to $2 million in cash, but there was also pink diamonds, rare jewels, ordinary diamonds, expensive watches.
They were lugging so much stuff out of there, they were exhausted, and they were doing it under the protection of the police. It's frightening. They were the police.
72 hours after breaking into the vault, Clemente and his crew escape with $10 million in cash and jewels.
Well, the first thing they did is they split the cash 6 ways. So they all got their take of the cash, which was about 200 grand apiece.
But dividing the jewelry is much more difficult.
The problem was then jewelry is identifiable, and they had a problem of how could they get rid of it and convert that into cash.
Clemente decides to leave it with Joe Banks. Now all he has to do is wait, and he and his crew will be very rich. But this treasure will set one gang member against another and threatens to destroy them all. Jerry Clemente and his crew of crooked cops have pulled off a brilliantly planned bank burglary, netting more than $10 million in cash and jewels.
When the bank manager came in on Tuesday morning, he found on the floor of the vault papers in empty boxes between knee-deep and 4 feet high. One of the people who came to protect the scene until the FBI arrived was Sergeant Thomas Doherty.
The robbery's lookout man is now a spy inside the investigation. Doherty keeps Clemente informed of FBI progress.
The speculation was there had to be an insider involved, there had to be someone with local knowledge. A number of people were interviewed, including Tom Doherty, Jerry Clemente, both of whom were on duty during part of that weekend. But while there was a lot of speculation and rumor that Jerry Clemente was, in fact, the mastermind, there was no physical evidence connecting him to the burglary.
When investigators try to shake Clemente's alibi, his mistress, Barbara Hickey, backs him up.
He instructed her that if she were asked where he was on those nights, that she was to say that he was with her for the entire night.
Knowing authorities have nothing concrete, Clemente stonewalls.
The fact that Jerry is a captain in the police department means that he understands police procedure. He understands the rules of evidence. He knows what it is that they need in order to prove that he did it. He also knows that they can't put it together. So he feels that even though they have strong suspicions, and even though they can make life difficult for him, that he's in the clear.
The FBI continues to investigate. They put Clemente under 24-hour surveillance, but Clemente knows he's being watched.
Without knowing the guy, it's hard to describe the arrogance. He just figured he was untouchable. They had thrown everything they had at him, and he walked away.
As the case against him grows cold, Clemente lies low, waiting for the statute of limitations to run out.
Jerry's very conscious that at this stage, they have less than a year to go, and they're home and dry in the Depositors Trust heist.
The clock was ticking, and honestly, unless something happened, this was going to be an unsolved crime.
But just as police are about to abandon the investigation, Clemente is hit with a crisis. Tommy Doherty and Joe Bangs start spinning out of control.
They're both using cocaine heavily. They're both incredibly paranoid.
And soon the friction between them with the freebase and being paranoid, and they also started to think one of them might be dropping a dime on the other, and that's when the whole ball started rolling down the hill.
All of a sudden, guns are out, and Joe Bangs gets shot. It's the worst thing that could have happened. One, that Tommy shot him. Two, that he didn't kill him, because it just brought total chaos to their whole operation.
The state cops arrive to investigate the shooting. They find drugs and jewelry in Joe Bangs' car.
That jewelry allowed a clear link to be made between Joe and the Depositors Trust heist. And it allowed the police to put pressure on Joe.
With police leaning on one gang member and another in jail, Jerry Clemente is facing the greatest threat of his criminal career.
So his life is basically turned upside down. But he knew that if he just kept his cool, and that if the others kept their cool, that they couldn't be broken.
With the discovery of the stolen jewelry, police are determined to bring down Clemente and his gang.
The adrenaline gets fired up a little more. And it's one of the biggest crimes that committed in the century. I mean, these are bad cops. If you're bad cops, you want to get them.
While authorities build their case against Clemente, Tommy Doherty goes on trial for the shooting of Joe Bangs. Doherty's lawyer presses Bangs about the jewelry found in his car.
Isn't it true, Mr. Bangs, that you had a kilo of cocaine in the trunk of your car? Yes, it is. And isn't it true that you had some jewelry in the trunk of your car? Yes, it is. And I suppose that jewelry was stolen, too. Bangs responded. He finally had it. He goes, "Yes, sir. It was stolen jewelry. I stole it with your defendant on Memorial Day weekend, 1980. And the whole court went into an uproar. It was the biggest break that came along on it.
Doherty is found guilty, and Joe Bangs tells prosecutors everything about the depositor's trust heist. But police need more.
Joe Bangs carried a lot of baggage and had very low credibility. The problem we faced is that a jury would say, you're only saying this and implicating others because you want to save your own skin.
Investigators then get a break when they learn Clemente has left his mistress, Barbara Hickey.
They were working with her and working with her and working with her, and they were getting nowhere with her, none at all. And so they were kind of throwing up their hands and turning to leave when she said to him, well, I don't know if this helps, but would it make any difference that he came home one night that weekend loaded with dust and dirt all over him? Does that make cement powder and that type of thing? Would that be helpful to you?
For Jerry Clemente, Barbara Hickey's turning on the gang is the worst thing that could possibly happen. It brings down the whole house of cards.
Jerry Clemente is arrested and charged with 4 counts of breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony. Although the evidence against him is strong, he's unconcerned, continuing to believe he's pulled off the perfect heist.
Jerry was always super confident. He always had faith in his ability to get out of any situation that he might find himself in. He knew how to cover his tracks, he knew how to make sure that the right people were involved, and he knew how to make sure that when it came down to it, the odds were stacked in his favor.
He was an intelligent, articulate guy. He had spent a lot of time planning and preparing for this burglary, and yet I think to the end never believed that the government would be able to prove and have a jury believe and convict him of the crime.
But at his trial, his former mistress, Barbara Hickey, is the prosecution's star witness.
Out of a clear blue sky, he said that he was going to have a lot of money and he would never have to work a day in his life again.
Her testimony finally puts the corrupt cop behind bars.
Jerry got 30 to 40 years, so it was the maximum sentence, and they nailed it.
It's particularly satisfying when it's a police officer and you realize that this is someone who had corrupted the system, who had breached his trust, and who should be brought to justice.
After 10 years in jail, Jerry Clemente is paroled. He is currently without a job and is fighting for his police pension. He was the greatest smuggler in American history.
No, he was very shrewd. He was very smart. He was very calculating.
His customized superplane evaded sophisticated radar and outran government air patrols.
He's an outstanding pilot.
And landed tons of drugs in the last place authorities expected.
Compared to anyone else in the drug business, he was a genius.
Find out how he did it next on Masterminds. In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration declared war on drug smugglers.
Our commitment to this program is unshakable.
Colombian drug cartels were hiring Americans to fly their narcotics into the U.S. Authorities identified Florida as the main point of entry and learned the smugglers fit a consistent profile.
The individuals with the flashy gold and the watches and the as I refer to as the Miami Vice type that you know, they want to almost advertise that I am a drug smuggler.
Customs and drug enforcement agents targeted these smugglers.
The government subsequently put more agents down in Florida to combat this.
A secret network of sophisticated radar was installed throughout Florida and the Gulf Coast.
The government also put up a bunch of planes that were basically flying radar systems designed to catch drug smugglers.
Air patrols created a massive dragnet over land and sea. All suspicious vessels were tracked and targeted.
80% of your risk of being arrested is entering the shoreline of the United States, being intercepted by Customs or DEA.
Authorities' efforts paid off. drug rings were busted. Tons of narcotics were confiscated. Millions of dollars were recovered. And the smugglers themselves were chased out of the sky.
If you looked around down in Miami and down around off the Bahamas, all you're going to see is crashed airplanes.
In spite of their success, however, the DEA realized one smuggler was eluding their security net and landing billions of dollars worth of cocaine. They launched a massive manhunt.
This investigation was considered the #1 case in DEA worldwide.
But authorities couldn't find him because they were looking in the wrong place. This smuggler didn't operate out of Florida and didn't fit the profile. He was an upstanding businessman living in small-town Pennsylvania. Rick Leitchus was a friend of presidents, a world-class aviation expert, and the mastermind who smuggled 10 tons of cocaine into the U.S., lining his pockets with millions.
He brought in more cocaine than any other drug smuggling ring in this country, and that's quite an achievement.
The question is, how did he do it? Rick Leitchus is America's most successful smuggler, flying over $20 billion of cocaine into the U.S. From an early age, Leitchus is obsessed with flight.
He just loved to fly. He got his pilot's license when he was still in high school. He was gifted at flying and at the mechanics of the planes.
After graduating college in the late 70s with a degree in aeronautics, Leitchus starts a business in Scranton, Pennsylvania, called Air America. The company specializes in luxury upgrades to small planes.
If you're flying a plane to Canada, it's nice if you don't have to stop to refuel. Bring your plane to Rick, pay him $100,000, and he can outfit it.
The quality of work that came out of Air America was top-notch. It was excellent.
Air America was very well known and had a very good reputation in the airline industry.
He was really good to his workers. He paid them a fair wage, more than a fair wage. They all liked him.
Rick donates to local charities, befriends the police, even flies the state governor around on business.
He ingratiated himself with politicians, with government officials, with leaders of the community.
Air America thrives until recession hits hard in 1980. Rick's corporate clients are replaced by shady characters, requesting their planes be outfitted with hidden cargo space. One of them insists on paying his bill with a bag containing 3,000 Quaaludes. Desperate for cash, Rick tries to sell them.
Well, his mechanic happened to know somebody down in Philly that could probably move these things. One of the first sales he made was to an undercover cop.
Rick is arrested and questioned. Authorities quickly determine he's a financially strapped businessman, not a serious dealer. But because the DEA suspects his company is being used by drug runners to modify their planes, they offer him a deal.
The DEA recruited him almost immediately off of that Quaalude thing.
In return for dropping the charges, Leitchus agrees to report any suspicious activity at Air America.
So he was kind of in the drug business, whether you liked it or not.
Rick realizes the DEA is right. Many of his clients are drug smugglers, and they're making millions more than him. Then in 1981, one of Rick's shady customers offers him a big payday to pilot for a Tampa pot smuggling ring. With Air America now on the brink of bankruptcy, Leitchus accepts.
Long-range goal, he wasn't going to stay in that business forever. At least that wasn't his original intent. The original intent was to make a little money, boost his business up so he could turn his back on smuggling.
But Rick quickly discovers the people he's hired to fly for are amateurs.
Most drug smugglers were people who used the merchandise themselves They weren't the most stable, reliable people. He commented to his friends about how sloppy they were.
Fuel tanks sit dangerously exposed in the cabin. And the route he's forced to fly is crawling with DEA. But Leitchus manages to land the plane and earn his money. After flying 2 more runs, he quits the ring. But his professionalism brings him to the attention of Jorge Ochoa.
Jorge Ochoa was one of the main members of the Medellin cartel, which was a group of individuals who controlled the cocaine coming into the United States. When you have access to a person like Jorge Ochoa and you work directly for him transporting his cocaine, you can't get any bigger than that.
Ochoa dazzles Rick with promises of millions and all the adventure he can handle, smuggling the cartel's cocaine. Still in desperate need of money, Rick accepts, but the Colombian leaves him with a warning.
If you cheat us, we'll kill you. Rick accepted that and came home.
The problem Leitchus now faces is how to make the 6,000-mile round trip from Pennsylvania to Colombia. He knows landing to refuel during the voyage risks alerting authorities. But the only aircraft that can fly non-stop are large cargo planes.
Those airplanes get on the watch list right off. And eventually those airplanes get caught.
So Rick sets out to turn an innocent-looking Cessna 310, designed to fly 900 miles, into a long-distance superplane. The first step is to increase fuel capacity.
Rick took a plane that would normally carry 2,000 gallons of fuel and outfit them so they could carry 6,000.
But the government had law enforcement looking for airplanes that had tanks inside the cabin or suspicious-looking plumbing.
So Leitchus stores extra fuel in rubber bladders, hidden in the nose, under the cabin floor, in the luggage compartments, and in hollow spaces in the wings.
The plane was basically a flying fuel tank.
To control the flow of fuel from these extra tanks, Leitchus builds a centralized distribution system that supplies the engines evenly while maintaining aircraft balance. But with added fuel comes added weight.
Once you add that much fuel, you needed to reinforce the wings, you needed to reinforce the wheel struts, you needed to increase the strength of the engines. So he would put in engines with much more horsepower. Anyone looking at it would say there's no way that plane can fly from here to Colombia.
To avoid suspicion from authorities, Leitchus obtains an FAA certificate declaring all the modifications perfectly legal.
And law enforcement doesn't have any probable cause to mess with the airplane.
Inside the cockpit, Rick installs custom-designed radar to alert him to weather conditions and government air patrols.
If Rick was a genius, it wasn't only equipping the planes, it was figuring out a way of evading the radar and drug enforcement system.
To defeat the DEA security dragnet, Leitchus targets a crooked customs agent who sells him a list of radar locations, plus flight paths and schedules of all coastal patrol aircraft. He also sets up a radio network spanning 2 continents and develops a secret communications code to keep in contact with the cartel during flight.
No, he was very shrewd. He was very smart. He was very calculating. It was obvious he put a lot of thought into each step that he did.
Throughout his preparations, Rick is careful not to arouse the suspicion of his contacts in the DEA.
The agents got very close to Rick. Part of it was that he is a charming guy, and I think he charmed them.
Finally, after 3 months of planning, Rick takes off on his maiden voyage and flies a direct route to Colombia. 13 hours later, he arrives. While the Colombians load his plane with coke, Rick makes a careful calculation of the plane's new weight and the exact length and state of the runway.
The trouble is the fields that they were taking off from were generally unpaved. There were trees at the end.
After a short rest, Rick departs. His tiny plane carries 800 pounds of cocaine and is 2,000 pounds heavier than the recommended limit.
The plane had to struggle to get off the ground and clear those trees. And off the coast of Colombia, there are a lot of wrecks of planes that didn't quite make it.
The engine modifications and upgraded horsepower in Rick's plane get him safely airborne, but he doesn't return home by the same route. Instead, he takes a new flight path that authorities had never even considered, the 73rd Meridian.
He figured out that if he could equip the planes to fly further, he would stay out of the pattern of radar detection.
But 5 hours into the flight, Rick's custom-built aircraft detection system alerts him to a Navy tracker plane hot on his tail. Using his weather radar, he locates a nearby electrical storm.
If you're getting painted by radar and what you're worried about is being caught and going to jail for the rest of your life, you might be willing to go into a storm assuming that the law enforcement pilot's not going to do that.
To escape, Rick flies straight into the heart of the storm.
Rick was an outstanding pilot. If he wasn't the best drug smuggling pilot, he was damn close.
The Navy vessel refuses to follow and loses him on the radar. 2 hours later, Rick emerges from the storm and turns sharply inland. Flying below radar, he heads for an abandoned commuter landing strip. He approaches the runway, but instead of landing, he rises sharply to 1,500 feet. After flying 3,000 miles from Colombia, he appears on radar for the first time.
He would fly very low altitudes to penetrate the radar and pop up so he could look as though he's a normal airplane.
Rick then radios the Scranton Control Tower and has them log his flight as a brief commuter hop. Arriving safely home, he unloads 800 pounds of cocaine and collects over $1 million. His success, however, will be threatened when his Florida pot smuggling days come back to haunt him. Rick Leichus has been paid over $1 million by the Medellin cartel for smuggling 800 pounds of cocaine into the U.S. The cartel is so impressed, they have Rick make regular runs for them over the next year.
Rick was in it because it was an adventure, and the money allowed him to do the adventurous things that he wanted to do.
Gaining confidence, he now expands his operations, hiring extra pilots and increasing flights.
It's like you feeding a mouse to a big cobra. You're going to be really careful the first couple of times you do it. But if that cobra doesn't bite you, pretty soon you're just casually lifting the lid, throwing the mouse in and closing the lid. And you do that time and time again.
Leichus prides himself on the efficiency of the operation.
He used to joke that he was the Federal Express of the drug business.
Rick used to brag that he would be plus or minus 3 minutes of any time you told him anywhere in the world.
The first 4 trips we did, the Colombians were ready for us. When we were ready for the 5th trip, the Colombians told us we had to wait because we ran them out of product. They were giddy with the schedule.
They never lost a flight, never crashed. They always delivered on time. And the Colombians appreciated that. They even gave him a raise.
Meanwhile, the DEA, not realizing that Rick is a smuggler, lean on him for more information about the drug trade.
And he did manage to provide a lot of useful information, but it was very strategically chosen.
Then, in 1984, disaster strikes.
One day the cobra's pissed, and he bites you. You see, you think, Why did that happen? That's never happened before.
The Tampa pot ring that Leitchus flew his first smuggling runs with is busted. He is indicted along with 15 others and sent to Florida for trial.
Rick's defense was, yes, he flew those runs, but he was only doing that in order to gain information about this nasty drug ring for his friends in the government.
Leitchus even convinces his DEA handlers to testify on his behalf.
They all either came down or wrote testimonials to his fine, upstanding character.
But Rick's biggest fear is the Colombians. To convince them that he's not ratting them out, he flies coke runs every weekend during the trial.
Each weekend he'd come home and dropped his lawyers off, hopped in the airplane and went to Colombia and brought a load back.
He'd bring in 200 to 300 kilos of coke, drop them off, get a little bit of sleep, and fly back down to Florida on Sunday to be ready to sit in trial again Monday morning. The trial lasted 11 weeks, and during that time he made 11 flights smuggling cocaine.
Rick makes $13 million flying these drug runs and is the only defendant. The jury acquits. But Rick's enormous smuggling success leaves him with millions of dollars to launder. He enlists a corporate Scranton banker, Michael Coffey, to hide the cash offshore.
Michael Coffey helped launder Rick's money by not filling out the proper documentation.
Michael was ambitious, and he made a little extra for providing this service.
But Rick suddenly faces a bigger issue. Jim Cooper is in police custody. He has crashed his plane into the car of a man waiting to offload drugs and killed him.
Everybody says I crashed the airplane on top of this car. And I say, this guy parked his car underneath my airplane. He had done cocaine all day long and was blitzed out of his head, and he and I met in the middle of the runway.
When Cooper is charged with felony murder, his first call is to Rick Leitchus.
Rick had the option of throwing a little money my way. He could have said, look, you need to disappear, go down the islands and get a tan for about 9 months. But he didn't choose that.
Jim was facing up to 20 years in jail, and instead he worked out a plea deal where he didn't get any jail time, and in exchange he provided information about Rick.
Armed with Cooper's confession, the DEA makes its move on Air America and Rick Leitchus.
And the way we did that was what we referred to as following a paper trail. In other words, going after where he landed an airplane, finding out there was a gas receipt, where he purchased radio equipment, finding out there was receipts for that.
The feds also bring in a money laundering specialist to examine Rick's bank transactions. Realizing authorities are closing in, Leitchus immediately wires $30 million to the Cayman island of St. Eustatius and flees there himself.
St. Eustatius and a lot of the islands don't have extradition treaties with the United States.
Forensic accountants trace his money to the island, and the DEA appeals to local authorities.
Myself and another agent provided information showing that Rick was wanted back in the United States.
They prevailed upon the government there to deport him as an undesirable alien.
St. Eustatius law enforcement agrees to cooperate. In 1986, Rick is arrested by local police, taken to the airport, and handed over to the DEA.
They got him, put him on a plane, brought him back. When they got into U.S. airspace, they told him he was under arrest.
Rick is charged with conspiracy to smuggle cocaine. To avoid 345 years in jail, he cooperates with the investigation and reveals where he has hidden the cash.
We seized over $21 million in cash and/or assets.
He also gives up his team, all of whom end up serving time. Rick himself goes to jail for 8.5 years.
Rick was a combination of Christopher Columbus and Charles Lindbergh.
Rick wasn't afraid to take a risk. He wasn't afraid to learn about something he knew nothing about.
Compared to anyone else in the drug business, he was a genius.
Bottom line is, he hurt a lot of people. I mean, you bring in 9 tons of cocaine, you're hurting people. You're hurting children, you're hurting families, you're hurting people.
Since his release, Rick Lychus has gone straight and started a new life in Florida.
Last thing I heard, he was living in a place called Smuggler's Cove. Very apropos.
He ran the biggest airport theft operation in North America.
He had everything, had it all. That's the only way to describe it.
For years, police were fooled by his ingenious system.
He is a mastermind because he stayed under the radar. You got to respect him for that.
He sought inspiration for his crimes in a Buddhist temple.
He had $1,000 bills in frames posted on the walls, and he would pray to the money.
And made over $7 million. Find out how he did it next on Masterminds. Pearson Airport in Toronto has some of the largest cargo terminals in the world. The biggest is the size of 2 football fields.
It's just a monster of a facility, all computerized, and every day cargo comes in and out of that location.
Millions upon millions of dollars of goods every day arrive in the morning, evening, and night, and it is nonstop. If you wanted to steal within that cargo facility, there's a lot of product. It's like walking into a large candy store.
The candy store was protected by a force of over 100 police officers on full-time airport duty. But in the late 80s, authorities discovered entire skids of high-end products, some worth up to $500,000, were disappearing.
The cargo that was missing was staggering. We had Canon cameras, we had Fujitsu hard drives, we had Kodak cameras.
They had every Kodak camera that was destined for Toronto area for the Christmas season.
We had Nike products, including their merchandising, their clothing. We had the entire spring collection of Banana Republic stolen. We're looking at $6 million worth of product missing and unaccounted for. If it wasn't nailed down, it was being taken.
Police formed a task force to discover how the thieves were bypassing the airport's heavy security.
Everything is secure on that perimeter. You got a wall or high-stake fence with barbed wire. There are video cameras monitoring it, and everyone can see video cameras posted nearby. There are also security guards posted. They view your tag, check its validity, and then allow you access.
But in spite of these precautions, cargo kept disappearing, and years of police investigations went nowhere.
There are a number of difficulties inherent in investigating any occurrence at the airport. Typically, they call us saying we can't find merchandise in our vast warehouse, and now we believe it's stolen. Can you investigate the theft from a week ago?
Police found the closed world of the air cargo workers impossible to penetrate.
The employees we spoke to were very guarded with some of their remarks. Those people have worked together for such a long time that anybody that tries or attempts to infiltrate those groups is looked upon as an outsider.
If we are doing surveillance at a mall, we could blend in with thousands of other cars. At the airport, it's not like that.
But their investigation did lead police to one conclusion. The thefts were the work of an organized crime ring operating inside the airport.
The reason why we thought it was a large number of people was you needed to know all of the ins and outs of the cargo operations, the flight landings, the way bills, the information that came on those way bills. You had to know people in security, you had to know supervisors, managers, you had to know drivers. So all of these factored into our idea of that it was a large group of people stealing the stuff out of cargo.
But the police were wrong. The thefts weren't the product of a large criminal organization. They were the work of a lone truck driver. Hoa Lam Ong had found a way to bypass security, steal over $7 million in cargo, and sell it worldwide. The question is, how did he do it? Hoa Lam Ong emigrates from Vietnam to Toronto in the late 1980s.
He came with $50 in his pocket when he arrived in Canada.
But Ong has a burning desire to become rich, hidden beneath an easygoing charm.
He always was kind of like a center point whenever you would see him meeting other people. He seemed to stick out, and he had a bubbly personality.
In the tight-knit Asian community, he makes friends easily and earns the nickname Smiley. He soon meets a fellow Vietnamese immigrant, Teresa Pang, at his local Buddhist temple.
They met through a mutual friend. Sparks flew, and next thing you know, they were married.
Smiley moves into Teresa's apartment and adopts her teenage son, Benny.
Teresa worked at Golden Jet Freight Forwarding out of Pearson Airport. They're responsible for shipping property from the cargo facilities.
She helps Smiley get work with Best Choice, another shipping company. His job is to pick up goods from the airport and deliver them to businesses throughout the city. But it pays only $400 a week. To realize his dream of making it big, he decides to break the law.
Everybody's human. Everybody's got their threshold. What point do you break? How bad do you need the money? That's what it really comes down to.
Smiley calculates that if he can keep even a fraction of the merchandise that passes through his hands, he'll be a very rich man. He spends months trying to gain access to the goods inside the cargo facility.
Within cargo, you must display your pass, and you must have it on you at all times.
The problem is, Smiley's pass limits him to a tiny area of the warehouse. He realizes the only way to steal the goods is to get the cargo workers on his side.
He had a way of dealing with people.
You gotta be able to be smooth. You gotta be able to have the gift, the gab.
He's interacting with employees all around the airport and developing relationships, sizing them up.
Smiley gets to know the guys and quickly identifies who's hard up for cash.
Over a period of time, he would offer them gifts. He would hand them a box of frozen lobster and say, hey, you know, the next time I see you, maybe you can help me out.
So he'd come in for a legitimate load. He'd pick up 3 or 4 skids in his truck.
Then he would approach an employee within the cargo facility, ask them if they could throw something extra on his truck, and he could supply them with some extra money.
Smiley invests every dollar he has to kickstart his cargo theft operation. But now that he has the goods, he needs a way to sell them.
In the beginning, when he started working, Smiley would search people out for the goods.
He started off small and was selling it through different friends, different fences, as we call them.
That could be people that own flea markets, that could be people that own computer companies, clothing companies, various merchandise stores. He had to have all those connections within his community. And that's where his empire started to grow.
Using his profits, he starts drawing in more accomplices.
Smiley carries a wad of cash with him. 50s, 100s, people referred to him as always having a lot of money. And that would allow for instant payment for property.
But Smiley's ability to buy everything cargo workers have to offer soon creates a serious problem.
Some of the property is very difficult to move in high volume. It's quite difficult to get rid of 80 pairs of pants within a day unless you've got a clothing buyer, and there's not quite as many of those people as there are for electronic companies that are willing to buy 80 of a particular item.
But help is close at hand. Through her shipping job, Teresa has access to detailed information about incoming cargo.
Teresa was very important to Smiley. She would tell him the flight that it came in on, the amount that it's worth, which area that this product would be brought into. The two of them were like two peas in a pod. They bounced ideas off of one another. They knew that they had to survive together in order for this operation to continue.
Using the information from Teresa, Smiley carefully studies what cargo is going to which warehouse. He cross-references this to lists of employees he knows he can bribe.
Smiley would look at his schedules and figure out who was working, what time the product was coming in. So he's very keyed in on those factors. He had to have a group of people working within that could be anywhere from 5 to 10 people on any given day.
By targeting expensive goods that are in demand, Smiley is now able to pay up to $10,000 for a single skid of merchandise. His accomplices inside the warehouse inform him when the most desirable cargo will be available.
Then it just began to grow and grow, and it was like a snowball rolling down the hill. It just, it was incredible.
But as Smiley further expands his network of connections, it draws the attention of organized crime gangs. They demand a piece of the action.
The message given out by a lot of these guys was that, hey, you mess with us and life won't be the same for you.
He would have to pay certain people within that facility a certain amount of money in order to continue operating.
Smiley makes the payoffs and stays in business. Now free to steal with impunity, he turns over his distribution network to stepson Benny Pang.
He had to get some people around him that he trusted that could help him move that product and make extra money. Benny was utilized by his stepfather as just a pawn in the scheme of things.
Smiley assigns Benny to sell computer parts to small businesses throughout the city.
He would go and profess that he was a part of this particular company and sell them hard drives at a good price, and he sold a lot of them there.
To make the business look legitimate, Smiley prints professional-looking invoices and business cards for Benny.
The business cards he had were first name of Joe, and some of those computer store operators knew him as Joe Hard Drive.
A lot of these companies thought they were actually buying a legitimate product.
Benny proves to be an excellent salesman, but even he can't move all of Smiley's growing inventory.
The business was being overwhelmed. His ability to bring the goods in was much better than Mr. Pang's ability to move it out, and it was essentially stacking up.
Because renting public storage space is risky, he buys 2 suburban houses.
Smiley used them as a storage facility for all the product that was being stolen out of Pearson cargo warehouses. It was a great way for Smiley to wash money through real estate, buy some property and investments that would make money over time.
When his new neighbors meet him, Smiley turns on the charm.
They acknowledged that they had seen some of this activity, but Smiley was very friendly, and he said, I'm, shipper-receiver, and they bought into that, so they never questioned whether or not he was involved in some sort of illicit activity.
Smiley now expands his operation to cover the entire airport.
I guess they figured, this stuff is selling. The more we can get, the more we can sell. These guys were just getting bigger and bigger.
Smiley Ong is at the top of his game, making millions. But a random break and enter will soon threaten to bring him down. Smiley Ong's cargo theft operation is now North America's largest, but he's struggling to sell his enormous inventory. He turns to his Buddhist faith for inspiration and flies in a monk from China.
Both houses had a prayer room, and these rooms were immaculate. They didn't have any stolen property in them, simply areas for prayer. Prosperity is certainly one thing that you pray for. They had $1,000 bills in frames posted on the walls, and they would pray to the money.
Smiley's prayers are answered, by the internet. He instructs Benny to set up an account with eBay.
And this is where a lot of the money was made, selling the stuff at a cheaper price and not having to go out and physically drop off the product, which made it much easier.
It's a dream for anybody selling stolen property. And basically, it's a license to print money.
It's also a dream for a seller who wants to hide his identity.
When they registered their name with eBay, they had the credit cards didn't belong to them. They had addresses that were fictitious.
Smiley now creates an eBay assembly line. For the first time, he can quickly move products like cameras and clothes that are hard to sell door to door. Benny monitors the bidding. Teresa is the shipping department.
He had everything, had it all. It was a mail-order Costco is what it was. That's the only way to describe it.
There was 19,000 transactions in total. We're talking a lot of checks and a lot of cash. We're talking about thousands of dollars of goods per day.
He had a lot of money, he did, and he didn't show it by the way he dressed or what he drove.
By day, he continues to keep a low profile, working his connections at the airport. But by night, Smiley hits the casinos to launder his cash.
To launder money at a casino, you put down a couple $1,000s. You might lose $300 or $400 that night, but once you go to reclaim your money, the money's already washed. You'll come back out with $20 bills and $50 bills.
Smiley also makes sure his business contacts at the airport are kept happy.
He used to bring people out to strip bars and would pay for their night out. And they thought he was the best guy in the world.
He ran a well-oiled machine. It was almost like a corporation, and he managed to do it, and he managed to do it well.
13 years into the investigation, police are no closer to identifying the mastermind. They intensify their efforts by going undercover, but still can't determine when a crime is occurring.
If you watch the cargo being loaded onto various trucks within that facility, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was actually being stolen right in front of your face or it was just business as usual.
It's also nearly impossible to narrow down the list of suspects.
On any given theft in the cargo facility, you'd have 300 suspects. But it just takes one mastermind to actually figure out a system and put their system in place. And once that system's in place, it takes investigators a long time to actually follow it.
Smiley definitely stayed under the radar of most investigative techniques.
But then in November 2001, police finally get a break. Within a skid of cargo Smiley steals is a box of hard drives. As soon as the theft is reported, police enter the serial numbers of these hard drives into a new system designed to track stolen goods.
Something gets stolen in Toronto, you put it in the system, and every police department in Canada has access to that and can check it. So, being able to locate stolen property is so much easier.
A week later, Benny Pang sells the stolen hard drives to a computer parts company.
That computer company put them in their warehouse, and on that very same weekend, that warehouse gets broken into.
The thieves take the same hard drives that Smiley had stolen from the airport. Police discover that the product serial numbers from the computer company theft match the numbers from the airport theft. For the first time, police have traced some of the stolen goods.
This was a huge, huge break in the case for us. We finally realized that we were going to be able to track where the product was being stolen from and where it was going.
Police questioned the computer merchant whose warehouse had been robbed.
We asked the owner, who are you purchasing these hard drives from? He indicated all he had was a pager number and a name of Joe.
When investigators check the number, they discover it belongs to Benny Pang.
And that was our first breakthrough to find out who actually was bringing these hard drives to these various computer companies.
Police begin surveillance on Benny.
Surveillance took us all across Toronto, and he'd be meeting people in parking lots, going to their houses. We knew we had the right player. The surveillance was quite intense. It led us to a lot.
They open the garage door. It's a wall of property.
We found out that the owner of the house was Mr. Smiley, Hoa Lam Ong.
But police hold off on making an arrest.
We knew that we had to build a larger case to find out where the product was coming from, where it was going to, and we had to actually physically see that.
Investigators follow Smiley to Best Choice.
That was the key. We were ecstatic. We had waited so long for so many years, and we finally had our connection.
13 years after Smiley Ong began stealing air cargo, police are ready to make their move.
And at some point in time, you say, okay, we've got enough. Let's close the door, let's get it done. We had Benny by the short and curlies, basically. Benny was done. We had him good.
On December 13th, 2001, they take down Benny at one of the storage houses.
Benny Pang was surprised. He was just shocked.
Now the police move on Smiley and Teresa.
Teresa Pang, along with Smiley, opened the door, and they were standing there in their pajamas. They were very surprised. They realized that the jig was up. You could tell through their eyes that they looked like two deers caught in the headlights of a large steamroller.
Then he proceeded to go in with the videotape, and that's when everybody's jaw hit the floor. In our wildest dreams, we never thought there was that much property there.
You could hear people shouting, "You need to come down and look at the room I'm in." And I was shouting, "You need to come up and look at the room that I'm in," because every room is stacked with stolen property.
That's so much property, they barely had room to move.
The police are also staggered by the amount of cash they find.
There was money everywhere. $80,000 in a Versace wallet. There was money hidden under the night table. There was money in Benny's room.
The total value of currency that was recovered was in excess of $1 million. I believe it was $1.2 million.
Smiley Ong and Teresa and Benny Pang are arrested on the charge of possessing stolen property. Before trial, Smiley agrees to plead guilty on the condition that Teresa and Benny are released.
Hoa Lam Ong stepped up and acknowledged that he was fully responsible for the entire operation, and he was the only one that was sentenced.
Because he cooperates with police and forfeits over $6 million in cash and property, master thief Smiley Ong gets a reduced sentence. In March 2004, he starts serving a 2-year prison term.
We cut the heart out of the operation. Since our arrests of Smiley's organization, we haven't had a major organized theft at Pearson Airport.
He was well organized, he knew what he was doing, he was very determined, and had a good business plan, probably a business plan that the Bank of Montreal would have approved if it was legitimate.
Smiley is a mastermind because he managed to keep himself afloat and always stayed under the radar. You got to respect him for that.
He ran the most successful car theft ring in American history.
He's a mastermind. He led a major enterprise that enabled him to make millions and millions of dollars.
His tightly controlled organization stole thousands of luxury vehicles.
They do it in a matter of moments. They are sophisticated. They know the latest technology on these high-end cars.
The police couldn't stop him.
He had tremendous discipline. This is what made him very good. And we had no idea who he was.
Find out how he did it. Next on Masterminds. New York City has America's largest concentration of high-end cars. Manufacturers of these luxury vehicles have equipped them with an array of sophisticated security features, including motion detectors that sound off when the car is moved, recessed door locks to foil prying tools, an electronic engine immobilizer to prevent the car from being started without the proper key. And if thieves do manage to steal the vehicle, a global positioning device concealed in one of 25 secret locations allows police to track it. But in 1999, a massive wave of car thefts hits New York.
We were losing cars at an unprecedented rate. In fact, we lost 48 high-end vehicles in a span of 6 to 8 weeks.
The thieves are so efficient, cars are gone in a matter of seconds.
They do so quickly, and they do so quietly, and they get away with it.
They knew what anti-theft devices they had to defeat. They had a plan.
They were stealing the cars out of our driveways, out of our commuter lots, out of our malls, and we've got to put an end to it.
Even more frustrating for police, the stolen cars weren't resurfacing.
Generally, what you'll see is when a vehicle is stolen for parts, it will show up out in the street. We call it the bones. All the high-end parts are off the vehicle would be used for resale. What we discovered is they weren't showing up.
The cars were simply disappearing.
Which was kind of odd, and leaves us, as an auto crime investigator, to believe the cars were being exported.
Now the question was, where were they going?
We learned that a number of the owners of these vehicles had Easy Pass in their vehicles. Now, Easy Pass is used as a form of payment when going through a toll.
By studying the computerized records of the victim's last toll payment, a pattern emerged.
The vehicles were going across the Triborough Bridge, and there's 2 locations they could have been going to, either Kennedy Airport or Brooklyn to be shipped out.
Police ruled out the airport as an export venue because of the volume of vehicles. But they found nothing in their search of the Brooklyn shipyards. And the investigation hit a dead end.
I knew early on that with the theft of these luxury vehicles that there was probably a very sophisticated professional car theft organization that was in operation and working in New York City.
The mastermind police were looking for was a former intelligence officer in the Chinese army named Minjin Yang. He stole and exported thousands of high-end vehicles and made himself over $40 million. The question is, how did he do it? Former Chinese Army intelligence officer Minjin Yang's career as America's greatest car thief starts 5,000 miles from the U.S. Discharged from the Army in the late 1980s, he moves to Shanghai, where there's a huge demand for luxury vehicles among the privileged class. But the cars are not sold in communist China. Seeing an opportunity to use the skills he honed investigating Asian smugglers, Yang approaches the Chinese underworld with a business proposition.
He was able to convince people in China that he could bring them vehicles door to door in 6 weeks, which, if you think about it, is about the time it takes to order a new car.
Yang strikes his deal, a 60-40 profit split. The buyers give him a $500,000 advance to set up his operation in the city where the cars are, New York.
You could steal a car in New York that's worth $60,000 and sell it in Asia for $120,000.
Kenny knew that if he came to New York, that he could get the type of vehicles that these people wanted. It was a good shopping ground.
Slipping into the country using false documents, Yang adopts the name Kenny and poses as a struggling immigrant.
This was all part of his scheme, and that was that he would blend in. He didn't want to stick out. Drove an older Nissan Altima that was leaking oil. It was not flashy.
Yang begins to execute his master car theft plan. He brings over a trusted associate from Shanghai, Poi Chow, to run the shipping operation. Chow's first task is to secure a warehouse where they can process the cars.
It was important to find a warehouse as quickly as possible. But the warehouse had to be just right, because A, it had to be away from a police station. B, it had to be on the quiet side. C, it had to be in a place that was not going to attract attention.
After weeks of searching, Chow finds the perfect location. Yang instructs him to lease the warehouse.
They created a dummy corporation called MSK Group. And the purpose of having a dummy corporation was that if, in fact, there was an investigation of MSK Group, it would not come back to Ken Yang. He tried to separate himself so that if, in fact, the walls came down, he would be protected.
Yang then recruits more trusted Chinese associates.
Those individuals were brought in by a Chinese organization out of Vancouver. They worked in the warehouse.
They camouflage the operation as a food company by loading in dry goods near the doors. Then they outfit the building with a surveillance system. Yang is now ready for the next step, finding the best car thieves in New York.
He didn't get his hands that dirty, but at the same time, he knew who to hire on the street to steal these vehicles.
Yang talent scouts an accomplished New York car thief known only as Dean.
He met Dean at an auction for salvage vehicles, developed a relationship with him, and then it was Dean who actually procured the professional car thieves.
He just wanted me to deal with the car thieves, then I deal with him. That's how it all started.
Dean knew a lot of individuals that would steal cars. One of his closest confidants was an individual by the name of Mario Lopez.
It was basically a four-part group. One part of the group was Dean passing along the orders to Mario Lopez, who then organized the theft of the vehicles. And the last part of the group was Asian-dominated shipping vehicles out.
Yang has created an organization that leaves him unknown to all but his closest lieutenants. With every piece now in place, he gives the order for the thefts to begin.
They would target high-end shopping malls, residential streets, commuter parking lots.
Mario was capable of stealing a car at any time, at any place, and he did.
Once the right car is found, Mario and his gang go to work.
You open the door, it will shut down the computer. So you would have to break the glass, go in through the window.
Lopez is a specialist at using computers to bypass security systems. He reprograms the car's engine immobilizer, allowing him to start the vehicle with a stolen generic dealer key.
Dean's crew was very knowledgeable in the theft of high-end vehicles, and they did it very quick. The whole operation of stealing a car would only take maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
With all of the anti-theft features now disabled, Lopez hands the car off.
Mario stole numerous cars and kept on passing them off to backup drivers.
After they stole the car, they would bring it to a good neighborhood where those types of cars wouldn't stick out.
Yang instructs the thieves to electronically scan the car to determine if it is equipped with a global positioning device.
Basically sends out a signal and lets the police know the location of the vehicles.
The global positioning device is removed and discarded. But in case it's already been activated, the thieves leave the car.
What Ken mandated was that all these vehicles had to be cooled down a couple of days.
And once that vehicle sat there for 2 days, they knew the police weren't looking for it.
Yang then orders Dean to have the car brought to the warehouse. This stage is also under his careful control.
The delivery took place around rush hour. He wanted the cars to be part of the commute.
Dean is instructed to have the drivers leave the cars a few blocks from the building.
He doesn't want the car thieves to know where the warehouse is at. That's the main reason of parking the cars a couple blocks away.
So only Dean and Mario would bring cars into the warehouse.
But Yang has designed one final test to make sure the police haven't followed the vehicles. He has Dean continuously circle the block in the stolen car.
They call it square the block. If somebody is following you, it becomes very obvious if they keep on making the same right turn or left turn that you're making.
A second scout car circles a wider area, also on the alert for police.
They had video cameras outside the warehouse, and they had monitors in the interior of the warehouse that they could look at, and they could monitor the traffic.
He will have his guys bring the car into the warehouse when he feels that it's safe.
From his vantage point on the street, Yang instructs Chow to open the warehouse loading bay.
When the gates were opened, the vehicles were brought into the warehouse and the gate was closed.
Now the warehouse team takes over.
If the thieves did any damage to the vehicle, that would be fixed at the warehouse.
They would actually repair the locks and cut keys.
That vehicle, when it was shipped, was in showroom condition.
The next step is to load the vehicles into Land Sea containers that Yang has had delivered to the warehouse.
These guys were very skilled. They used a couple of ramps to essentially load these cars into containers.
Knowing the exact size of each stolen car, Kenny designs the perfect system for packing them.
They would build a frame around it out of 2x4s and actually drive another vehicle underneath it. These cars were not moving around. They did not want to damage the merchandise.
After gauging the exact weight of the packed container, Yang forges convincing manifests for the shipment.
It would list as food product. The weight of the product would match the weight of what they were shipping. Once the container left the warehouse, it was trucked over to New Jersey. And in New Jersey, the container was put on a train, railed across the United States to California, and then put on a ship.
The vessel heads for the East China Sea, where it's met by another ship. The containers are covertly transferred, then delivered to China, along with new manifests that detail their real contents. With military precision, Yang lands thousands of luxury vehicles. But a simple traffic accident will soon threaten to bring his multi-million-dollar operation to a screeching halt. For the past 5 years, Ken Yang has made millions smuggling stolen cars to China. But the demand for these vehicles is outstripping his ability to steal them. To boost the supply, he has Dean order Mario Lopez to start hitting car dealerships.
Mario would go in, he would scout the dealership, take a test drive. He would spot where the car salesman would go to get the key out of the locked box.
Several nights later, Mario returns to the dealership.
And Mario would break in, go right to the box because now he knew where it was. Take the keys.
Mario's steel crew is waiting. In minutes, 7 new luxury cars are driven off the lot.
From the time the alarm went off, they were there 3 minutes later and everybody was gone.
But one of the stolen cars gets into an accident after exiting the Triborough Bridge. When police arrive on the scene, they discover the vehicle is stolen. The driver is arrested and turns on his fellow thieves.
And based on this accident, that led us to Dean.
An investigation of Dean eventually directs police to Ken Yang's warehouse.
We understood there was an export operation in a warehouse in Brooklyn. And we set up on that warehouse.
We did surveillances of that warehouse. Unbeknownst to us, they were doing counter surveillance in the area.
Yang soon discovers the police are onto him, but he's prepared. His operation is designed to fold quickly.
Ken had tremendous discipline. This is what made him very good. He felt that we were onto him, he just disappeared.
When police make their move, they find the warehouse abandoned.
The warehouse basically was emptied and he was gone. And we had no idea who he was, where he went to, or anything.
Everything goes quiet. But police put a tap on Dean's phone.
What we would hear on the phone would be People would always be asking Dean, when are the Asians coming back? When are the Asians coming back?
Hoping to take down the whole organization, the police hold off on arresting Dean.
On the one hand, we wanted to build a case against as many professional car thieves as we could. On the other hand, we wanted to learn where the vehicles were going, ultimately.
6 months later, Yang resurfaces.
Basically, Ken comes back to New York. He makes a phone call to Dean. It's a very cryptic phone call. I'm back. I have an order for 260.
Fearing he's being tapped, he orders the gang to keep changing their phones.
These are individuals who are very sophisticated. They were involved in disposing of cell phones, so even though we were up on 14 wires at one point, we had to constantly change and amend the wires, which requires court approval to keep up with their disposing of their cell phones.
We knew who they called, so we waited for them to call, say, a parent or a girlfriend from the next phone. And that would give us the number of the phone they were currently using. And then we would get a wiretap on that phone.
He thought that by changing cell phones, by not using his address, that he could hide his identity. His cronies constantly made mistakes by alluding to where they would have lunch.
Police send an Asian undercover officer to Yang's business lunches. For the first time, they get a look at the mastermind.
We could listen into the conversations. It gave us a window into the world of Ken Yang and his group. And so when we learned that they were looking at this warehouse, we sprung into action.
Kenny was setting up to fulfill another order. We were setting up to catch him.
We knew that we did not want police presence in the area if we could help it. So instead, what we did is we mounted cameras. We mounted cameras on telephone poles, we mounted cameras on buildings.
Police even managed to put a locating device into one of the containers to find out where the cars are going.
We worked with the New York State Police, the New York City Police Department, local police. I mean, this was an effort that was years in the making. So we had all of our bases covered.
For the first time, police have Ken Yang clearly in their sights. But unaware of their surveillance, Yang continues to ramp up operations with an ingenious scheme that targets parking garages.
Most parking garages in Manhattan, you leave the keys with the car. This way they can't move the vehicle around if another car has to get out.
Now, parking garage attendants in Manhattan don't make a lot of money. Mario Lopez had formed an alliance with a parking garage attendant, and a deal was hatched for Mario Lopez to steal a number of cars from that garage.
They would pay him $500 for the most high-end cars that he had in his garage. So the time was arranged.
After getting the keys to these vehicles from the parking attendant, they duct taped him and they left him in the garage. They then drove away with 7 cars. After somebody came down, saw this poor parking garage attendant tied up, they called the police.
In fact, by the time the police arrived at the parking garage, the cars were already at the warehouse.
By asking for more and more cars to be delivered, they made some mistakes. They got sloppy. They got greedy. They wanted the cars to come into the warehouse, and they didn't allow the cars to cool off.
One of the stolen cars in the warehouse has a GPS system that alerts police. The responding officer walks straight into the surveillance operation.
We were watching on camera. We were watching what was taking place. There was nothing we could do to stop it. We knew this police officer was going to walk in the door. The workers that were in the facility take off. So at this point, we realized we had to act, and we had to act fast.
We set up on Kenny's house. We had a car on each corner and one car down a block. A Oriental gentleman leaves the house. We ID'd him as Kenny, At that point, a decision was made to stop him.
Ken Yang is arrested and charged with multiple counts of car theft. But for police, there was one sour note.
Because of the takedown coming prematurely, we never really were able to determine where the cars were being sold.
At his trial, Yang pleads guilty to enterprise corruption and is sentenced to 10 years in prison.
His downfall was that we were smarter than he was. We've sent a message to car thieves in this county and the surrounding area that we have intelligence, that we know what you're doing, that we have the ability to bring you down, and that we are more sophisticated than you are.
Ken Yang is obviously a very intelligent person. He gave a lot of time and energy and a lot of thought into his operation. He led a major enterprise for many years that flew below the radar, that went undetected by law enforcement, that enabled him and his partners in crime to make millions and millions of dollars. That's why he's a mastermind.
Authorities estimate Ken Yang made $40 million during his 10-year car theft operation. None of it was ever recovered. He was the mastermind behind the biggest retail fraud in U.S. history.
He was very, very sharp. He was very, very shrewd.
And used techniques investigators had never seen before.
He had more fires and floods than the Bible.
He had ingenious tricks in order to defraud investors.
He was such a larger-than-life Brooklyn Fonz that he fooled Wall Street into thinking that they were fooling him.
And vanished with hundreds of millions of dollars. Find out how he did it. Next on Masterminds. Wall Street, the epicenter of high finance. The place where private businesses raise millions to expand their operations. In 1984, investment firms fought to take a chain of electronics stores called Crazy Eddie public.
It was one of the hottest IPOs in Wall Street history, and the stock went up like a rocket.
The stock went public at $8 a share. Split adjusted, it went to an equivalent of $80 a share.
Investors scrambled for a piece of the company that had revolutionized the electronics business.
Crazy Eddie was the father of the retail electronics chains. They didn't exist prior to Crazy Eddie stores.
Instead of selling home electronics in stuffy department stores, Crazy Eddie used the capital it raised to offer discounted merchandise in a party atmosphere.
Hold on to your beanies! Crazy Eddie's coming to Princeton!
And created the most relentless ad campaign New York had ever seen.
It's Crazy Eddie's greatest TV and video sale ever!
Between this visionary promotion and the great deals in the stores, Crazy Eddie became a household name.
Get anything and everything in TV and video. Get it now during Crazy Eddie's greatest TV and video sale ever.
They were the electronics store. That was where you went to get your great deal.
Crazy Eddie had better name recognition than Coca-Cola.
The chain crushed the competition. Its market dominance became unstoppable.
Come get it, Crazy Eddie's! Crazy Eddie's! Thank you, sir.
Go get the best price you can find, and then come to Crazy Eddie's and we'll beat it.
Crazy Eddie expanded at a phenomenal rate. What began as a single outlet in Brooklyn had by 1987 grown into a vast empire of 39 superstores that employed more than 2,000 people.
At the zenith, the company was the largest electronics retailer in the tri-state area.
The insatiable appetite for Crazy Eddie's deals drove the stock price ever higher.
Its eventual market capitalization at its peak was over $600 million.
But what nobody knew was
Insane!
the Crazy Eddie empire was a massive fraud.
Crazy Eddie brought this company public to defraud the public. There's no doubt in my mind at all.
The company's founder, Eddie Antar, had done a lot more than just cook the books. He employed an amazing array of techniques never seen before and lined his pockets with over $200 million in cash. The question is, how did he do it? Eddie Antar is the mastermind behind the Crazy Eddie empire and the greatest retail fraud in American history. Antar was born into a tight-knit family of merchants from low-rent Brooklyn.
Eddie learned literally on his father's knee to be a swindler.
His father and some of their other family members routinely would take home cash from his discount retailing business and basically divvy it up among themselves.
But Eddie's dreams are bigger. By his early teens, he's hawking cheap consumer goods obtained through shady connections. He's barely 20 when he marries his high school sweetheart, Debbie Rosen, and opens his first Crazy Eddie store.
Eddie had the ambition, the drive, the vision of making the big time. You see, Eddie didn't want to be a neighborhood guy. He wanted to be world famous.
Eddie was a great salesman, but better than that, he was very, very sharp. He was very, very shrewd.
He was pretty much considered the early master of the bait and switch, where he'd get a customer in and trying to buy a $99 piece of merchandise, and he'd sell them for $4.99.
He said, people want hope and dreams. We'll sell them hope and dreams.
Right from the start, he skims money.
There was a culture that said the tax man does not deserve to have any of our money. Eddie would skim off all of the cash sales of the business so they wouldn't have to report those as taxable income.
Eddie then hires trusted family members and pays them off the books to further avoid taxes and scrutiny. Crazy Eddie thrives. But manufacturers start withholding stock because Eddie sells below their list price. Faced with empty shelves, he fights back.
Eddie said, I don't care if I have to get the goods out of Canada or Europe or Africa.
He survives by sidestepping manufacturers and obtaining merchandise through family connections to the underground market.
He broke their hold on the price fixing, and that was his claim, that he was the champion of the New York electronics consumer.
Eddie also uses these underground connections for cornering the market on the next big thing.
He knew the Walkman was a winner. He had shiploads of Walkmans on the water. By the time other people were looking to buy them, and you couldn't buy them in quantity.
Eddie now opens 2 new stores and hires close relatives as managers, allowing skimming to continue and reaping hundreds of thousands of dollars. But to Eddie, this is small change. He sets about to increase his take by millions.
If you're a retailer, the biggest single asset you usually have is inventory. And so if you can falsely claim inventory that you don't have, that boosts your assets.
Eddie bought used and damaged merchandise and sold it as new. That used television is now in a heat-sealed plastic bag. It looks fine.
Eddie also commits extensive insurance fraud.
Eddie had more fires and floods than the Bible.
He convinces insurance adjusters that stacks of empty boxes contain damaged merchandise and collects hundreds of thousands of dollars on phony claims. But with his business expanding, Antar knows he risks becoming the target of surprise visits from financial auditors.
Now, when the auditor wanted to go out and see the inventory, okay, what do? Our count sheets show us at X, our inventory is at Y. We have a problem.
His solution is to plant a spy inside the company that audits Crazy Eddie. He sends his cousin Sam to accounting school for an all-expenses-paid education.
That brought great loyalty to Eddie. And when Eddie would say jump, I would say how high.
So Sammy went off to college, got an accounting degree, went to work for the CPA firm that actually audited Crazy Eddie's, learned how audits were conducted so that he would know where the holes were.
With Sam placed on the inside, Eddie's confidence grows. By 1978, Eddie and his family are skimming $1 for every 5 they bring in, reaping millions.
The skimming was handled now as just as a division within the company. It became institutionalized within the company.
But Eddie is running out of places to hide his cash.
There's millions in safe deposit boxes, in the bedrooms, in the houses. There's millions in the ceilings.
He solves that problem by taking monthly trips to Tel Aviv and depositing his money in numerous secret bank accounts.
I've seen deposit slips of $1 million at a time. I've seen bank balances totaling over $6 million.
As his illegal profits skyrocket, Eddie employs his wife and family as couriers. They transport over $11 million to his Tel Aviv accounts. While they do the dirty work, Eddie dreams of greater glory.
He's looking to be a star, and he's not a star yet. Donald Trump is bigger than him. So how do you make it? You go public.
He saw taking the company public as his brass ring.
You can do much better with phony income in a public company than you can in a private company because other people are buying your stock.
But before Antar can approach Wall Street, his company must first undergo a thorough financial audit. He calls on his spy, Sam, who arranges for an inexperienced auditor to be assigned the job. The naive rookie is greeted at the front of the store. At the back, Antar's staff piles up masses of inventory shipped over from other stores. Antar shows the auditor an example of the merchandise he has come to tally. Then a helpful employee is sent up to count the stacks.
She would call down 70 large screen TVs. And if you looked at that row as the auditor from the ground, you could count 70 boxes. You could see how many there were across and how many there were down.
But the entire stack is little more than a facade. The auditor dutifully records the inflated numbers he is given. Antar goes further when he distracts the auditor and alters his inventory tallies right on the count sheets.
He would take every one and make it a 4 or a 7, and then give them back their altered papers. And so where they had written down 10, it was now either 40 or 70.
Even better, the files give Eddie crucial information about the next stores the auditor plans to visit and the sample counts he intends to take.
So that night, they had these poor guys loading up the truck again and driving to store B. And they just kept a step ahead of the auditors in doing that.
The auditor paints a portrait of a thriving company. Eddie Antar is now ready to strike. Armed with 13 apparently successful stores, he sits down to seal the deal with Wall Street.
Here were the investment professionals, the Wall Street sharks, thinking they were cleaning up these dumb Brooklyn street guys. And the supposedly dumb Brooklyn street guys are playing them. He was such a larger-than-life Brooklyn Fonz that he fooled the crooks on Wall Street into thinking that they were fooling him.
With the money he rakes in going public, Antar opens 26 new stores in under 3 years and quietly cashes out $40 million worth of his own shares. At the annual Crazy Eddie shareholder meeting, he is greeted like a rock star.
Eddie came and did the Rocky, hands over his head, and the crowd started chanting, "Eddie, Eddie, Eddie." And at that moment, Eddie Antar was as happy as he ever was in his entire life.
But what Eddie doesn't realize is the magnitude of his success threatens to bring his vast empire crashing down.
Hold on to your beanies. Crazy Eddie's coming to Princeton, New Jersey with his greatest man-owning frat party ever. Crazy Eddie's coming to 2100 Route 38 in the Cherry Hill Shopping Center. Crazy Eddie's coming to 150 Broadway, corner of Liberty Street, Manhattan. Be there.
Crazy Eddie Antar, the darling of Wall Street, is using the 39 stores in his 3-state empire to line his pockets with millions.
Crazy Eddie's, thank you. Insane.
But now, he's got a problem.
You have to feed the beast more each year. It's one thing to tell the auditors on the ground there's 70 TVs, but he can't tell them there's 7,000.
They weren't making money, they were losing it. And so this has a cumulative effect. If you lose money in one year, then you essentially have to double down every year, and the fraud has to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
The stress starts wreaking havoc in his family life. Antar fights with his wife, Debbie, and takes up with a mistress, also called Debbie.
It was like trading in your car. Besides the same name, they looked very similar, except that Debbie 2 was the younger, sleeker version.
On New Year's Eve, 1984, Antar's wife catches him cheating with Debbie 2 when she is led right up to his car by Antar's sister. The incident causes a rift in the Antar clan.
And that eventually led to the downfall of the family.
You have to make the mafia comparison. They are united in their joint effort to make as much money as they can. And if they turn on one another, the game's over.
With his family life in tatters, Eddie's business problems now worsen.
The gap between what they were taking in and what they were called on to report by virtue of the fraud they had committed was becoming just unbridgeable.
The discovery of this kind of fraud was inevitable, and Sam E. knew it and feared it.
Eddie acts quickly, cashing out another $30 million of stock before the price crashes.
And people said, that doesn't sound very encouraging. The founder, the namesake of the company, is reducing his position. And so people started looking, and they found discrepancies. When they found discrepancies, they started talking to the SEC.
New faces and new hands came in there and new eyes. It was no longer this tight inner-knit circle that he could control, but there were people there that he could not control, and it wouldn't take long for it to unravel.
A business rival soon moves in and buys Crazy Eddie in a hostile takeover bid. But Antar has the last laugh. The new owner quickly discovers the inventory fraud, a staggering $80 million worth of non-existent merchandise.
It was basically a hollowed-out shell by that time, and that it had largely been looted by Eddie.
Before police can arrest Eddie on a racketeering charge, he flees to Israel, armed with 6 passports and access to his stolen millions. Sam is left holding the bag.
And I said, fine, if I'm on my own, I'm on my own. And I decided to come clean.
With the knowledge gained from Sam, authorities launch an international manhunt for Antar, whose new life on the run is not working out the way he had hoped.
You have to think of how big his need was to be noticed, to be admired, to get attention, all of which is completely inconsistent with going underground. There's no flashy sports cars, there's no flashy women. He couldn't live that way.
Authorities get their break 2 years later, when Eddie, needing money, comes to Geneva and attempts to withdraw funds from one of his secret accounts. To his surprise, he learns that the account has been frozen.
I think there was about $40 million in that account. And Eddie evidently was not happy that it was frozen.
Eddie's attempts to recover the money fail. He leaves empty-handed. But the Swiss contact American law enforcement, who trace his steps back to Israel.
He was caught when he left the apartment and he started driving, and they had a female police officer who was wearing a micro mini dress and no underwear and bent over the hood of the car, exposing herself, knowing Eddie couldn't resist. He stopped, he got out, he patted her on the ass, said, "That's a great ass," and she said, "You're under arrest," and handcuffed him.
Jailed in Israel, Eddie Antar loses his fight to avoid extradition and is sent back to America to face justice. Eventually, Antar admits to 17 counts of fraud. He owes $150 million in fines and restitution, and close to $1 billion in civil lawsuits. He goes to prison for 8 years.
We heard investors, we heard creditors, we heard consumers that might have lost their refunds. We heard the people that work for us that lost their jobs. There are countless other people who got hurt directly or indirectly from the frauds that we committed.
You have to think of it as the Sephardic Jewish Goodfellas.
They were a pack of thieves. The whole family was a pack of thieves. And there's no honor among thieves.
Eddie could have been an extremely successful businessman who could have gone on to even bigger things.
Eddie was like a force of nature, but like a tornado, when it was over, there was nothing but wreckage left.